Hello everyone, welcome to my channel. I am here to help you today. I know you use this video to fall asleep, so before that, like the video and subscribe to the channel. Also, where are you from, and what time are you watching? Now get comfortable and relax. Case 1. In June 2002, a match was made on the South Wales Police DNA database that would end a 29-year search for answers. Investigators of the Landersea team had finally unmasked a potential suspect as the Saturday Night Strangler, a local man who was suspected of committing the rapes and murders of 3 young women. The story of the Landersea killer would begin in July 1973 with the death of a young hitchhiker, Sandra Newton. This crime would go unsolved, along with 2 more murders in September 1973. In their hunt for this vicious killer, detectives interviewed scores of suspects, and with the help of a psychological profiler, they slowly whittled down their list of thousands of suspects to just several hundred. But ultimately, their efforts came to a dead end. With advances in DNA technology in the late 1990s, police were finally able to search for the killer by using his genetic fingerprint left at the crime scene, and the pursuit of justice resulted in one of the biggest police investigations in Welsh history. On a relatively warm sunny day in May 2002, a large group of people gathered on a steep Welsh hillside at Port Talbot's Goitre Cemetery. But these were not mourners attending a funeral. They were an exhumation team, consisting of forensic archaeologists, forensic dentists, scientists, pathologists, and policemen. A large blue tent was erected over the grave of Joseph Capin, and as dusk fell, the digging started. The weather soon turned sharply cold, and a storm broke. Heavy rain came lashed down, thunder cracked, and streaks of lightning split the sky. Although it was a ghoulish task, the group were hoping to extract dead man's DNA and match it to the Saturday Night Strangler, Wales' first documented serial killer. As twilight had finally fallen after a long day of digging, the team of detectives and forensic experts hunched around the large newly made hole in the ground as the dirt-covered coffin was slowly brought to the surface. As ominous flashes lit up the night sky, one man looked at the other and muttered, "Looks like he doesn't want to come up." The hunting ground of a killer. In September 1973, 2 young friends, 16-year-old Geraldine Hughes and her best mate Pauline Floyd, meet at the popular Top Rank nightclub in Swansea, South Wales. With songs by Mark Bolan playing to the crowd, the dance floor is packed. Located on the floor above, Roger Moore is playing James Bond in Live and Let Die to a large crowd of cinema-goers. Known as The Rank, this nightclub is the most popular spot for youngsters of the time, one of the swankiest discos in South Wales, that drew huge crowds from miles around. But that night, Saturday, September 15th, something was different. Among those having a good time at the Rank that evening was one man who had other thoughts in his mind besides dancing and frolicking. But no one there would have known his intentions, or that he was a sexual predator. Hidden in plain sight, with his shoulder-length hair and sideburns, he was indistinguishable from all the other would-be male suitors. This was a time, long before the term serial killer was even known, and little was understood about the criminal mind. As the young man stood there, it is possible he had already picked out Geraldine, a bubbly teenage girl wearing a white mini-dress with a big laugh, and her friend Pauline, a quiet girl of just 5'4", who liked to wear rings on her fingers and green nail varnish. On that fateful night, the 2 young girls faced an awkward journey home. They lived 7 miles away in the neighboring villages of Landersea and Skewen. There were no buses at 1 a.m. when the disco ended, and taxis were an expensive luxury. Few people had cars back then. Pauline and Geraldine both worked in a sewing factory and earned £16 a week. A taxi at the time was £4. In order to get where they needed to go, the young girls hitchhiked, something that many others did. Although the cinema billboard illuminates light into the wet Swansea night, it would soon be extinguished by government order. The country was in the grip of an energy crisis, with a war in the Middle East sending oil prices soaring, as well as miners on strike, resulting in coal reserves that were soon starting to deplete. All across Britain, street lights, advertising signs, and cinema billboards are turned off in a desperate attempt to stave off power cuts. As the girls sheltered at a bus stop in the spitting rain, just a few hundred yards from the club in the direction of home, a passing motorist observed a white car swerve to the side of the road and pick the girls up. As Philip O'Connor sat at the next set of traffic lights, the white car draws alongside. He glances over and sees both girls in the front seat chatting away to the driver. He is able to catch a glimpse of the man, sporting bushy hair and a mustache. However, most of his face is hidden behind the girls. Pauline and Geraldine both worked in a sewing factory and earned £16 a week. A taxi at the time was £4. In order to get where they needed to go, the young girls hitchhiked, something that many others did. Although the cinema billboard illuminates light into the wet Swansea night, it would soon be extinguished by government order. The country was in the grip of an energy crisis, with a war in the Middle East sending oil prices soaring, as well as miners on strike, resulting in coal reserves that were soon starting to deplete. All across Britain, street lights, advertising signs, and cinema billboards are turned off in a desperate attempt to stave off power cuts. As the girls sheltered at a bus stop in the spitting rain, just a few hundred yards from the club in the direction of home, a passing motorist observed a white car swerve to the side of the road and picked the girls up. As Philip O'Connor sat at the next set of traffic lights, the white car draws alongside. He glances over and sees both girls in the front seat chatting away to the driver. He is able to catch a glimpse of the man, sporting bushy hair and a mustache. However, most of his face is hidden behind the girls. A large police murder inquiry was launched, and a team of more than 150 detectives was swiftly assembled. It would prove to be the biggest murder investigation in Welsh history. The crime scene at Landersea lies in the center of the heavily populated South Wales industrial area, the landscape of which is dominated by steel plants, flaring oil refineries, and deep-water docks. The main towns of Swansea, Port Talbot, and Neath are easily accessible and just minutes away along the M4. Police learned from passing motorists that a white car, soon to be identified as an Austin 1100, was seen parked at the entrance to the cops between 1:45 a.m. and 2:15 a.m. on that Sunday morning. It was likely this was the killer's car, but none of the eyewitnesses saw the number plate. The motor vehicle provided a potential link to another murder that occurred 3 months earlier. On July 15, 1973, 16-year-old hitchhiker Sandra Newton was found strangled, her body dumped close to a local disused colliery. Like the other victims, Sandra had been raped and strangled, with the killer seeing the hem of her chiffon skirt to choke the life out of her. She was last seen walking home from a nightclub in the neighboring village of Britton Ferry after a Saturday night out. Subsequent investigations learned that an Austin 1100 had been going like the clappers in the area around the time of the murder. The papers soon came up with a sensationalized nickname for the killer, calling him the Saturday Night Strangler. The police investigation, led by Chief Superintendent Ray Allen, set up a murder room in Skewen Police Station. With no computers to compile information, the team instead rely on a complex manual card index system, as well as a wall-sized white board known as a graticule, which was divided into tiny squares in which individual inquiries or actions are listed and then crossed off when completed. In an effort to warn the public about the dangers of hitchhiking, police print up a poster that reads, "Danger, thumbing lifts has LED2 murder, don't." Barbara Williams, a close friend of Pauline and Geraldine, recalls there were police, dogs, panda cars, going round all the time everywhere. No one walked the streets. My mother would not let me out of her sight. It could have been the milkman, the postman. A flurry of tips, reports, accusations, and false leads poured into the murder room. As a result, the inquiry was soon drowning in the very paperwork it had requested. The strongest lead came from the eyewitness motorists who provided the type of car seen at the crime scene, that of a white Austin 1100. The search for the owner of the suspicious car would prove to be both laborious and time-consuming. In 1973, cars are registered in local taxation offices, and although the team obtained a list of Austin 1100 owners, it involved trawling through the records in each office. This produced a list of more than 11,000 white Austin 1100s. Each owner is visited by members of the team, and they are only eliminated from the inquiry once they provide a statement of their whereabouts on the night in question, and only when this is alibi verified by a statement from someone else. As part of the investigation, police questioned workers who were in the process of completing the final stages of the M4 construction, as well as employees at the steel works in Port Talbot, which comprised some 13,000 men. One line of inquiry saw detectives scour the country after fairground workers, after it was learned that the murders coincided with the annual Neath Fair. Meanwhile, detectives were divided over the inclusion of a third case, one that bore striking similarities to the Landersea murders. The death of Sandra Newton occurred just several months earlier, and at the time, her married boyfriend confessed that they left the nightclub together and had a quickie in the back of an abandoned van. He told police he then left Sandra at the roadside and walked home in the opposite direction. It was the last time he saw Sandra. But the police found the admission of adultery an awkward fact, and in public it was denied that the victim had been sexually assaulted. The quickie the lovers shared was not disclosed. The boyfriend didn't have a license and never owned a car, while Sandra's body is found miles away. This would have meant he was cleared, but there was still a lingering suspicion that he was responsible. The most important piece of evidence the team had at the time was a cast made of a car that had been at the site of the murders. Eventually, the Skewen Murder Room compiles a collection of 35,000 index cards, each containing names in different subject categories such as suspicious acts, rumors, psychics, pregnant women, queer person, and psychopath. This wealth of information helped create a list of 10,500 nominal suspects, 11,000 car questionnaires, 4,000 statements from Austin car owners, and 10,000 miscellaneous statements. But this many tips and eyewitness reports had to be checked, and every piece of paper is supposedly cross-indexed, a mammoth task that proved overwhelming for the investigating team. In an effort to appeal directly to the public, Chief Superintendent Allen holds a press conference and requests that the killer's relatives to turn him in. We are pretty certain he is being shielded by someone, could be a woman, could be a relative, or someone close to him. That Sunday morning, his shoes must have been muddy, his clothing could have been bloodstained. This man is sick and needs medical attention. He could kill again unless we can get him to a doctor. Let the police know about him before he kills again. We will look after him. But no one turns him in. By mid-1974, the murder investigation is quietly wound down, and the inquiry has run out of credible leads. The Saturday Night Strangler had escaped justice. But the pain for the families of the victims never went away. On the third anniversary of the murders, Geraldine Hughes's mother Jean organized a protest march comprising 50 of her sewing factory workmates to 10 Downing Street. And there the group stood, under the watchful gaze of the number 10 staff, with their handmade banners proclaiming, "Bring back hanging." Jean Hughes posed for the photographers holding her 9,000 signature petition and said, "I can't accept what happened to Geraldine. It has left me very bitter," she said. "If they ever catch the person responsible, they should hang him. I want him to feel a rope around his neck like the girls felt." But her march on Downing Street is futile, and she does not achieve what she set out to do. Britain's government is preoccupied with troubles at home, such as industrial strife, economic meltdown, and rebellious unions. Besides, even if they did agree to bring back capital punishment, in this case there is no one to hang. Back in South Wales, the trail has gone cold. But the investigation, like any unsolved murder, was never officially closed. When the Landersea murder inquiry was wound down, all of the boxes of evidence and boxes of statements, along with much of the girls' clothing, was shipped to Sandfield's police station in Port Talbot. There it stayed for nearly 30 years. But due to the passage of time, some of the boxes of statements had got damp, ruining the information contained within. Thankfully, the most valuable forensic material, such as the girls' underwear, was retained in dry storerooms at the Home Office's Forensic Science Labs in Chepstow. In the intervening years, the case was reviewed with a new investigating team, who trawled through the paperwork and questioned a new suspect. But this was more of a formality than a serious investigative venture. Even with the advent of DNA technology in the mid-1980s had little influence. This was mainly because these early DNA tests required a fresh sample of DNA material the size of a 10-pence piece, or even blood or semen, in order to extract a successful DNA profile. The stains on a Landersea victim's clothing from a decade earlier were of no use, and as each review closed without a conviction, the chances of catching the Saturday Night Strangler faded with every passing year. By 1998, a new technique had been developed in the form of a low copy number DNA test that could utilize just a tiny speck of DNA material. The girls' clothing and swabs of DNA taken from the crime scene were sent to a specialist research lab in Birmingham for testing. But this new test was a long, protracted, and complex process, which involved separating the DNA of the girls and the killer, which had become intermixed in the 25-year-old samples. It would take almost 2 years of work before the scientists could get a result. But this was only in the form of a partial profile of the killer's DNA from Geraldine. While the result from Pauline was unambiguous, a full genetic profile that could be expressed as a string of numbers. This small measure of success now meant that the police had, at last, a genetic fingerprint of the killer. But what they didn't know was his identity. In order to locate him, A search was made of the Criminal National DNA Database, NDNAD, that holds 1.7 M profiles, but the Landersea killer wasn't one of them. If justice was going to catch up with him, detectives would have to go looking for him. January 2000 saw the establishment of Operation Magnum, an official reinvestigation of the Landersea murders some 27 years after the killings. This new criminal investigation was considered as an unprecedented, with no previous unsolved British murder, and possibly even no unsolved murder case throughout the world and in history, has ever been successfully reinvestigated so long after the event. The Magnum team was considerably smaller than previous investigation squads, and comprised only of Detective Chief Inspector Paul Bethel, described as a gregarious hulk of a man, and two aging detectives, both of whom were 30-year veterans close to retirement, Geraint Bale and Phil Rees. The new team under Bethel reassembled the Landersea murder room in a rundown police station in the village of Ponardaw, an area close to the murder scenes, and their Rees and Bale set to work. Their plan was to DNA swab those suspects considered as most likely offenders, and then match their DNA to the Landersea killer's profile. This meant they had to compile a list of just 500 suspects, because Bethel had a budget for just 500 swabs, by first combing through every piece of paper and rule out those least likely from the 35,000 names in the files. It was during this comprehensive search that the team uncovered a number of unsolved rapes in the Neath area. There was little information on these attacks, and no DNA evidence because the women's clothing had been destroyed. But it was noticed that 2 of these rapes, carried out in the months prior to the 1973 murders, bore a strong similarity to the Landersea killings. Much like the Saturday Night Strangler, this balaclaved rapist used ropes to subdue his victims after lying in wait, then grabbing them from behind and punching or threatening them into submission. "Don't scream or struggle, or I'll kill you," he told the women. As he bound their hands, he asked, "Are you a virgin?" Each woman was then raped vaginally and anally. Victims recalled few details about the rapist, but some remembered that he wore an anorak, had a mustache, and smelled strongly of tobacco. At the end of their ordeal, he would masturbate as his victim lay naked on the ground. "Don't open your eyes. I'm going to have a cigarette and think about whether I'm going to kill you or not," he told one victim. Bethel's team now wondered if the Neath rapist and the Landersea murderer the same man, and if so, could they unmask him by using evidence from the rapes. The Operation Magnum detectives decided to draw one investigative tool that their 1973 colleagues didn't have, that of psychological profiling. The benefit of criminal profiling is something that has benefited criminal investigations and led to the apprehension of a suspect. The Landersea team were hoping they could make use of this technique and called in Rupert Heritage, former chief of the Behavioral Science Unit of Surrey Police, to draw up a 14-point profile. The profile created by Heritage predicted that the killer would be white, aged in his late 20s to mid-30s, and would have a history of minor property crime. It was likely he would have come to the attention of the police as a juvenile at around age 12, and was likely to live in the Neath area, where the rapes were committed. It was highly probable that their suspect was a violent individual with a history of assaults and possibly animal cruelty. He would come from a broken family background, in the form of an absent father, was unskilled in low-paying employment, and had a troubled marriage. It's likely he would collect weapons and have solo sports interests. Using this profile as the basis of their investigation, the Magnum team began eliminating names from their list of 35,000 potential suspects. Rees and Bale spent 8 long months locked away in the file room working through the list, knowing that the smallest bureaucratic misfiling could mean missing out on the chance to catch the killer. "No one outside the team ever believed we would get a detection from this," says Rees. Bethel explained, "It was like throwing a dice for 2 years. Perhaps he, the killer, was not in that room. Why could it not have been a traveling Scotsman, a Swede on a boat in Swansea docks that night who sailed away the next day?" Eventually the massive list of names was whittled down to just 500, and then Rees and Bale began trying to locate the men on the list. This proved yet another logistical nightmare. In the intervening years, much could have changed in the lives of these possible suspects. 30 years was, after all, half a lifetime. People marry, move home, emigrate abroad, and change their name. The homes where they lived at the time of the murders could have knocked down, the streets redeveloped and rebuilt, or they may have died. Firstly, the 500 nominal suspects were prioritized into 5 groups. The first 50 swabs were of witnesses, relatives, stepfathers, boyfriends, anyone who had featured prominently in the initial inquiry. After them came ordinary criminal suspects. They then used several different methods in trying to track down these men, such as DVLA records, the passport office, and tax and criminal records to find addresses all over, some even as far away as New Zealand. Once the nominal suspect was located, the Magnum team had to persuade each man to volunteer his DNA. We were looking for a particular tree in a forest. In order to find it, you had to cut down all the other trees. The beauty of DNA is that you can once and for all eliminate a suspect, says Bethel. Over the next 8 months, none of the 353 men whose DNA was requested refused to provide a sample. Such a refusal would, of course, have automatically triggered suspicion, but many of the men on their list were not happy being questioned about sex murder that occurred over 30 years ago. Selling double glazing must be easier than selling a DNA test. It usually took 2 hours. The easiest people to deal with were those with convictions. They just wanted it out the way. We ended up swabbing in barges, taxis, and hotel rooms. The worst was always their sitting room in front of the wife, says Rees. When the DNA test results started coming back, the team waited patiently for the moment they finally got their man. But that moment never came. Each time a nominal suspect was swabbed, the team were, in turn, presented with yet more paperwork generated by the failures. A typical example of this was nominal suspect number 200, named Joseph Capin, who it was learned lived on the Sandfields estate in Port Talbot. In August 2001, Rees went to Capin's address to collect his DNA sample. His ex-wife, Christine Powell, was still living there at the property, but Rees learned that Capin wasn't. He had been dead for the last 12 years. Rees had to check her claim against the local death register, and then reassigned Capin to the dead pool, where the names of nominals ended up while the team tediously awaited final elimination by cross-checking with family members' DNA. 2 months later, in October 2001, the Magnum team had their first breakthrough. DNA specialist Dr. Jonathan Whitaker, who had been working on isolating genetic material from evidence in the Sandra Newton case, had managed to extract a profile from swabs taken from Sandra's body. It was a 3-way mix, says Bethel. Sandra, the boyfriend, and an unknown individual. But the unknown matched the profile from the Landersea murders. It was the same man. Now, for the first time, all 3 cases were definitively linked to the same perpetrator. The killer had dumped Sandra's body in a water culvert close to the disused Garth Colliery. This culvert was so remote and well hidden that it could have been known only to someone local. I knew we'd get him then, says Rees. We knew he was living locally. He was someone who must have been spoken to, and he had an 1100. The team were one step closer to catching their man, but they still didn't have that important piece of the investigative puzzle. Then, in October 2001, Whitaker came up with an ingenious way of unmasking the killer. This case happened in 1973. The offender could have had children, he said. Was it possible that there was a relative of the offender on the database? It was his understanding that because people inherit DNA from their parents, and in turn pass on 50% of that DNA to our offspring. Whitaker believed that because he had the killer's DNA profile, he also had 50% of the killer's children's DNA. If he could locate the killer's children, he would find the Saturday Night Strangler. Much like the suspect list, this would once again prove to be another laborious process of elimination. However, this time, Whitaker had the advances of computer technology at his fingertips to delete thousands of names with the touch of a button. He starting with all the profiles submitted to NDNAD by the South Wales Police, and then started searching for a version of the killer's profile. Whitaker was able to eliminate non-related profiles at each stage of a 10-step process, thereby reducing the list of 22,000 possible suspects to just 100 names. These were the men whose genetic profiles were closely related to the Landersea killer. It was a unique way to pinpointing the search to just a small list of people. We were looking for a father and getting to him by his son, says Whitaker. One of the names among this list of 100 was that of Paul Capan, a convicted car thief. His name proved very familiar to detectives. Paul Capan would only have been 7 years old when the Landersea killings took place, but that fact that there were 2 Capans in the files was just too much of a coincidence. Joseph Capan was now the number 1 suspect. The only problem was that he had been dead for the past 12 years. Rees and Bale returned to Sandfields and asked if Christine Powell and her daughter Deborah would volunteer DNA samples. The results took 2 weeks to process. I was sitting at my desk in the Ponardau murder room when the call came through from the forensic scientist, Colin Dark, says Bethel. He was going on about a partial match in the DNA banding. And I said, "What are you telling me?" He said, "I think you've got your man." It was a strange feeling, very emotional. I don't get excited or overwhelmed, not after all these years. But I really did get a lump in my throat. By subtracting Powell's DNA from her sons and daughters, the forensic scientists hoped to be able to recreate most of Joseph Kappan's DNA. What they eventually ended up with was a 3/4 profile of Kappan that was identical to that of the Landersea killer. According to the DNA, Kappan was the killer. However, the investigators had to be 100% sure he was their man before they went public and notified the families of the victims. I needed to be able to tell the victims' families, "The man in the grave is the man who killed your daughters. He's a serial killer." I wanted to be bloody sure that he was in that grave, says Bethel. On December 24, 2001, Bethel made an application to then Home Secretary David Blunkett to exhume the remains of his suspect. This was to be a historical first for this type of method for identifying a criminal. Kappan would be the first serial killer ever to be pulled from the grave to confirm his guilt. He was buried in Goitre Cemetery on the outskirts of Port Talbot, the graves of which were perched on a steep Welsh hillside. Kappan shared the family grave with his stepfather Clementi Proietti and grandfather Joseph Herbert, with his coffin being sandwiched in the middle. In order to exhume his coffin, all three would have to be dug up, with no guarantee there'd be any viable DNA to collect. It took 5 months for the permission to exhume Kappan to come through. In the meantime, the manhunt above ground continued. There were hundreds of questions we wanted answered. Where did he kill Sandra? Did he know the girls? Had he carried out other attacks? How did he get away with it? Who was he? Says Rees. He and Bale interviewed anyone and everyone who had associated with Kappan, while his name was given out to the local newspapers. Unknown victims soon began to come forward. The team began the process of learning everything they could about Joseph Kappan, in an effort to piece together his history, become acquainted with what type of person he was, and ultimately understand how a man could become such a monster. Joseph Kappan was born on October 30th, 1941, as Joseph Margam. One of 7 children, he grew up in Port Talbot and was eventually raised by his stepfather after the breakup of his parents' marriage. He came to the attention of the police at the age of 12, exactly as the psychological profile developed by Rupert Heritage had predicted. He spent many years in and out of prison and had a string of minor offenses, more than 30, for car theft, burglary, assault, and robbing gas meters. When not serving a prison sentence, Kappan worked as a driver of lorries or buses and gained some measure of notoriety as a bouncer, but he never held down a job for long, preferring to hobble, meaning he signed on for Social Security benefits and continued to work for cash on the side. Although he occasionally smoked cannabis and may have done a bit of dealing, his biggest habit was smoking tobacco. He chewed it and smoked as many as 20 Old Holborn roll-ups a day, enough to stain his teeth, and as the Neath rape victims recalled how the perpetrator smelled strongly of tobacco, it also made his clothes smell strongly of cigarette smoke. He had few friends. Kappan was a very deep individual, a loner, says Bethel. Lots of people knew of him, but no one really knew him. He'd go to pubs 2 or 3 a night. He was always out. He'd even be on the darts teams, but he never really drank, 1 or 2 drinks a night. He never wanted to lose his self-control. At the age of 20, Joe Kappan met his future wife, Christine, who was 17 at the time, on the beachfront at Port Talbot. It was 1962, and no one had any money in those days, says Christine Powell. You'd go into a cafe, get a coffee for 6 pence, and hang out. It was September and cold. The first thing that attracted me to him was that he bought me a hot chocolate to warm my hands. It was the first kind thing anyone had ever done for me. The couple were married for 18 years before divorcing in 1980. Christine described that when they first met, Kappan was a catch. She remembers that the 6'1" Kappan had a dark, almost Italian complexion with slate blue eyes. He was a physically imposing figure, and long before it was ever fashionable, Kappan worked out with dumbbells. Unlike many of the young men of that era, he had wheels. Joe was my first boyfriend. I didn't know about sex, men, women, or anything. He was tender and affectionate. He was always obsessed with cars. There were always 5 cars and bits in the front garden. He was always doing them up. Christine became pregnant during the summer of 1963, and the couple married in February 1964. There would be no honeymoon. 10 days later, Joe got sent down for 3 years for breaking into houses to rob gas meters. Their daughter Deborah was born in the April, and it wasn't until August 1965 that Christine would see him again. It was during his release on day parole to attend his grandfather Joseph's funeral. At the wake, with a warder downstairs, Joe dragged Christine into an upstairs bedroom and had sex. It was then that she became pregnant with their second child, Paul. By the time he was released from prison, Capin was a father of 2 children he had never met. But he soon settled into the role as head of his household. The couple moved to the Sandfields estate, and there the family lived what turned out to be an unhappy life together. Joe never bonded with the kids, only with Beverly, who came along in 1974, says Christine. We lived on the social. As a family, we did not have 2 pence to rub together. I could not rely on him for money, as he was always in and out of jail. He did stupid things, she said. He'd see some lead, pinch it, and then get sacked. He did not have proper money. If he hobbled, he might give me 20 pounds, but that was it. He had a car, which was his luxury. Often he'd take money out of my purse. But soon their relationship would take a darker turn. I thought it was natural for men to hit women, Christine continues. I thought all men were violent. He used to rape me every 2 weeks. It was against my will. I never wanted it. Joe would say, come on, and then he would insist on his conjugal rights. The couple fought frequently, and when police weren't knocking his door to ask about some unsolved burglary, they were often called around to calm things down. We never had an argument unless I was drinking, says Christine. I'd play our One Shirley Bassey record over and over. If he dared tell me to turn it down, I'd start. And then he'd hit out. But in the 1970s, police didn't interfere in domestic troubles, and Christine would never press charges. As per Rupert Heritage's profile, Capin enjoyed hobbies that were solo interests. The rearing of canaries, tropical fish, and greyhounds. One of the greyhounds became a family pet. His son Paul recalled when he was younger that one day, as his father was exercising the dog on the local beach, he decided it was too old. Joe picked up a wire and strangled the dog in front of his terrified son. It wasn't the first time Paul had bore witness to his father's unpredictable manner and vicious temper. In another alarming incident, he forced Deborah and Paul, both then under the age of 10, to wander the streets searching for fig roll biscuits to replace the ones they had eaten. It was 11 o'clock at night and pouring down with rain. It was clear to investigators that Capin ruled his family by terror, much as he had done with his victims in the short amount of time spent with them. Capin's name had first been provided to the original murder team back in 1973. It was a retired Port Talbot detective, Elwyn Whedon, who had given Capin's name to detectives. Capin was a bouncer in nightclubs, says Whedon. He was a man of violent disposition, a Fagin-like character who sought out boys and girls to commit crimes on his behalf. I first met him at a youth club, where he threw a boy down some stairs. There were no injuries, but you felt Capin was capable of anything, and I knew he had an Austin 1100. Upon receiving Whedon's tip, detectives from the murder team visited Capin on October 13, 1973, almost a month after the murders. But owing to an alibi, he was swiftly placed amongst those vetted and discounted. In his statement, Capin claimed to have returned from Meath Fair at around 9:30 p.m. on the Saturday, and then spent the rest of the evening looking after my canaries until about 10:45 p.m., when myself and my wife went to bed. I got up the next morning at 10:30 a.m. During the interview, Christine, who was sitting on the sofa beside him, had concurred. I alibied him, but I always did whenever the police came knocking. You learn to do it without thinking. On such and such a night he was with me, officer. I couldn't see him doing that. I cannot imagine him doing that to a child. I never saw any signs of an unusual interest in young girls, she said. But unknown to his wife, Capin regularly pursued teenage girls. Working as a bouncer, Capin came into contact with young girls. It was his thrill to go with younger girls even when he was 43, says Rees. If he had a girl, he paraded her around for show, to show his mates. In bed it was always regular sex, no violence, nothing out of the ordinary. In his other work as a driver on local buses, Capin would use his rest breaks on the village green at Landersea to try to chat up girls. He was a sexual predator, says Bethel. He always carried a weapon, a knife, and he had the ligature ready at Landersea. With him there is always predatory intent combined with arrogance. He was cocky, confident, not afraid to carry out crimes in his own backyard where the risk of being identified was always high. With his first killing, that of Sandra Newton, his arrogance was there for all to see when Capin made little attempt to hide the body. Capin began his assaults on women, all unknown to police at the time, in the early 1960s. Sometime in 1964, he attacked a 15-year-old schoolgirl as she was walking in the Sandfields estate. He followed closely behind, and as they entered a half-built house, he threw her to the ground and jumped on her. But when the girl screamed, he got up and ran away. There were further incidents involving young girls. In February 1973, a man resembling Capin, driving in Austin, picked up two female hitchhikers near Neath. As they neared their drop-off point, the man continued driving and took them to an isolated road, with one girl was in the front and the other in the back seat. The attacker stopped the car and told them, "I know you want it." The girl in the front seat was grabbed by the man who started pawing her breasts. The girl in the back seat reached forward to intervene, but he swung back his fist and punched her in the face. By this time, both girls were screaming and tried to escape, but found the car doors were locked from the inside. Luckily, the girl in the back had long nails and was able to grab the stub of the door lock and pull it up, opening the door, allowing her to pull open the front passenger door from the outside. Because of the screaming, the occupants of a nearby house were woken up and turned on their lights, and this is when the attacker fled. This attempted double rape was never reported to police because one of the girls thought she'd get in trouble with her father, a church warden. The attacker was almost certainly Capin, and his next victim, Sandra Newton, would not be so fortunate. Towards the end of his life, Joe Capin was suffering with lung cancer. After leaving Christine, he became involved with Sandra Wyatt, a local barmaid, and together they set up home on the nearby Baglon housing estate. Then in his 40s, Capin hardly left the house, according to Wyatt. He was diagnosed with cancer in 1988, and his body literally wasted away. By the end, the once strapping Capin was forced to use a wheelchair. He died on June 17, 1990, at the age of 49. He died never having been brought to justice for his crimes, but soon it was about to catch up with Joe Capin. By May 15, 2002, the exhumation team, consisting of pathologists, forensic archaeologists, scientists, forensic dentists, and policemen, were ready to begin their work. Over Capin's grave was erected a large blue tent, and the digging started as dusk fell. After the first coffin, that of Capin's stepfather, had been raised, the weather turned sharply cold and a storm broke. It had previously been a fine day. The heavens opened in thunder and lightning started, the like of which I have never seen, says Bethel. It was literally at the moment we came across the coffin of Capin. There was a tremendous sense of foreboding, he said. Is this evil being uncovered? I remember saying to the team, he doesn't want to come up. The coffins, all intact, were taken to a local mortuary and opened. It was there that Bethel finally came face to face with his prime suspect, some 30 years after the crimes. Teeth and a femur from the leg, the likeliest sites for DNA to survive, were removed by forensic scientists and sent for DNA analysis. Their work done, Capin and his relatives were swiftly reburied. 3 weeks later, the DNA test results came back. It was Joseph Capin. The Operation Magnum team had mixed feelings about their victory. To be honest, I was disappointed, says Rees. It was a letdown. You're not going to pull him in. It wasn't like arresting him and taking him to a court of law. But for Bethel, there was now final resolution in a case that had haunted investigators for decades. Operation Magnum, the hunt for the offender responsible for the Landersea murders, is closed. We are not looking for anyone else. But there were still many unanswered questions, such as how Joe Capin had managed to slip through the net during the original investigation. Just how did Joseph Capin get away with the crimes he committed during the 1960s and 70s? It was obvious there were oversights during the initial investigation. The most damaging was a small but telling inconsistency in his story. When detectives first turned up at his home, on October 13, 1973, nearly a month after the murders, his Austin 1100 was outside the house on blocks with the wheels removed. Probably because Capin was trying to switch tires after it was reported by the press that the police had a cast of the killer's tire track from the Landersea murder scene. Capin told the detectives he had put the car on blocks the day after the murders. However, in police logbooks of random stop and check operations in the week after the killing, Capin and his car were logged as being on the road. No one in the original police team made this startling connection. Without the convenience of logging the data with a computer, which would have made cross-referencing this information just a keystroke away, Capin's lie went unnoticed. Since 1973, it has become clear that serial killers don't stop until they are caught. I can't believe that if an offender is impulsive enough to pick up victims in his locality, risking being seen, that he would have any qualms about committing other offenses around the country or abroad, says Bethel. There have to be other rapes or unsolved murders that could be attributed to him. Cappen's picture has been circulated to every police force in Britain, and every 6 weeks his DNA profile is run against any new cold cases on NDNAD, in an effort to uncover any further victims. For the families of the murdered girls, the long wait for justice has been brought to an end. Their loved ones can finally rest in peace, despite their killer never being brought before a court for his punishment. You know there are evils out there, says Gene Hughes, but you never believe it will touch on you and yours. When it does, it is a lifetime sentence of hell. Now we can close the book on that hell forever. The decades-long hunt for the Saturday Night Strangler, which began inside the dance floor of a 1970s disco, ended when the perpetrator was disturbed from his grassy tomb and finally unmasked. Case 2. In June 1997, officers of the Suma Police Department in the Japanese city of Kobe arrested a teenage boy named Shinichiro Azuma on suspicion of murder, in what would prove to be one of the most bizarre homicide cases in Japanese criminal history. Almost a month previously, the decapitated body of a young boy was found outside a local elementary school, along with a handwritten note in red pen, in which the killer, who identified himself as Sakakibara, promised more murders. The style of writing was reminiscent of a serial killer who terrorized the American city of San Francisco over 2 decades previously. The case that reminded Japanese authorities of a killer who communicated with police was the infamous Zodiac Killer, who continues to remain unidentified. When 14-year-old Sakakibara was arrested, he confessed to a second murder committed in March 1997. The young killer's identity was kept secret owing to his young age, and he was referred to as Boya by the press. Sent to a young reformatory for treatment, he was released in 2004. The subsequent controversy surrounding the seriousness of his crimes as well as his early release would lead to calls for him to be sent to prison. When the San Francisco Zodiac Killer began his reign of terror against the residents of the Bay Area, few could have believed that these crimes would go unsolved. The Zodiac case both terrified and fascinated in equal measure, and received national and international attention. In the 1990s, a copycat killer emerged in New York. The Zodiac 2 murdered 3 and wounded 6 people. Then, in mid-1997, the influence of the Zodiac Killer was felt at an elementary school located in Suma, Kobe, the Japanese capital city of Hyogo Prefecture, where a twisted killer used the Zodiac crimes as inspiration for his own. On the morning of May 27, 1997, several hours before students began their classes, the janitor at the Tainohata Elementary School made a gruesome discovery. Placed at the gates near the entrance to the school was the decapitated head of a young boy. When police arrived on the scene, they discovered that the perpetrator had inserted something inside the victim's mouth. It was a note, written in Japanese and also containing some misspelled English words such as "shul killer." With a distinctive style and red ink lettering, the note made reference to future murders and challenged the police to catch him. This is the beginning of the game. Try to stop me if you can, you stupid. Police, I desperately want to see people die. It is a thrill for me to commit murder. A bloody judgment is needed for the years of great bitterness. The note identified the perpetrator by the name Sakakibara, and Japanese detectives familiar with the American Zodiac suspected that the killer had taken inspiration from the unsolved serial murder case. Police suspected the killer had hoped the remains would be discovered by the neighborhood kids, parents, and school staff, something that would have caused fear and panic among the local residents. The janitor who came across the victim reported to police that in the week preceding the discovery, he found on school grounds the remains of 2 mutilated cats with paws cut off along with several dead pigeons. The victim was eventually identified as June Hayes, an 11-year-old student of Tainohata Elementary School who attended a special needs class which was made up of children with mental and/or physical disabilities. The body of the young boy was later found hidden underneath a local house. From the autopsy, it appeared the killer had strangled June to death and then removed his head with some type of instrument, possibly a saw. There were no witnesses who saw the killer place the victim's head, and police had no idea what the motive was behind the killing. It wasn't long before Sakakibara made contact again. This time he sent a letter to the Kobe Shimbun newspaper on June 6, 1997, in which he claimed responsibility for the strangulation and decapitation of June Hayes, and threatened that more killings would follow soon. This letter, which was delivered in a brown envelope with no return name or address, and was postmarked June 3rd, contained 3 pages that comprised some 1,400 words. Written in the same red ink, it included a 6-character name that can be pronounced as Sakakibara. This name, which in the Japanese language means a variety of words such as alcohol, rose, fight, saint and devil, was also used in the first message that was left in the mouth of June Hayes. The letter began with the phrase, "Now it's the beginning of a game," and went on to state, "I am putting my life at stake for the sake of this game. If I'm caught, I'll probably be hanged. Police should be angrier and more tenacious in pursuing me. It's only when I kill that I am liberated from the constant hatred that I suffer and that I am able to attain peace. It is only when I give pain to people that I can ease my own pain." The letter also made mention of the Japanese educational system, calling it compulsory education that formed me, an invisible person. It appeared that Sakakibara wanted more attention towards himself and recognition for his crimes, something that he intended would cause panic in the community. During the initial press coverage, the Japanese media mistakenly reported the name of the killer as Onibara, which translates to Demon's Rose. However, the killer insisted his alias was as he gave it, Sakakibara. Infuriated by this mix-up, Sakakibara sent another letter to the station. He wrote to the station threatening, "From now on, if you misread my name or spoil my mood, I will kill 3 vegetables a week. If you think I can only kill children, you are greatly mistaken." This use of the word vegetables would later be explained by the killer, referring to people around him. Having learned this term from his parents, who had once told him, "If you are nervous at your athletic meet, picture the people around you as vegetables." It appeared the killer wanted and craved more recognition and attention towards him and for his crimes. It appeared likely that Sakakibara had intended to imitate the Zodiac killer, possibly because he wanted to be immortalized in the same way other serial killers had been by society and the media. The hunt for the killer ended more or less as quickly as it began. Just 1 month after the horrifying discovery of June's head on the gates of the school, police made an arrest in the case. On June 28, 1997, a 14-year-old junior school student was arrested and questioned in connection with the murder. Because of Japanese laws prohibiting the mentioning of minors' names by the press, the suspect was only referred to as Boya in articles and news reports. Despite attempts to keep his identity a secret, at least one Japanese tabloid published both his picture and real name after he was released. Shortly after his arrest, the boy confessed to the February 1997 attacks on 3 schoolgirls, who were lucky to escape unharmed, as well as another murder, that of a 10-year-old girl, Ayaka Yamashita, who was found fatally bludgeoned with a steel pipe on March 16, 1997. After the attack, Boye wrote in his diary, "I carried out sacred experiments today to confirm how fragile human beings are. I brought the hammer down when the girl turned to face me. I think I hit her a few times, but I was too excited to remember." The following week, on March 23rd, he wrote, "This morning my mom told me, poor girl. The girl attacked seems to have died. There is no sign of me being caught. I thank you, Bumoto Kishin, for this. Please continue to protect me." Investigators were unable to learn the meaning or identity of Bumoto Kishin, which continues to remain unclear. Not much is known about the young boy's childhood, except that he was known originally to enjoy torturing and killing small animals before progressing onto young children. He wrote in his diary, "When I advanced to junior high school, I had already become bored of killing cats, and gradually found myself fantasizing about how it would feel to murder human beings like me." He admitted to mutilating a variety of animals, including decapitating pigeons, and recalled one particular story in his childhood when he lined up a row of frogs in a street and rode over them with his bicycle, as well as mutilating cats and decapitating pigeons. He also enjoyed playing with dangerous objects as early as elementary school, writing, "I can ease my irritation when I'm holding a survival knife or spinning scissors like a pistol." Although he was deemed by social workers to be mentally unstable, his mother pressured Boye into taking and passing the entrance exams needed to enter a prestigious school. But this pressure only added to his violent and aggressive tendencies, causing him to suffer from internal bitterness, as well as having an effect on his interactions with the people around him. During a search of his bedroom after his arrest, police found thousands of comic books and pornographic videos, which some suggested might have fueled his homicidal killing spree. Some Japanese politicians such as Shizuka Kame were quick to blame the media and society in general, and calling for a restriction of objectionable content, he stated. Movies lacking any literary or educational merit made for just showing cruel scenes. Adults should be blamed for this, and that the incident gives adults the chance to rethink the policy of self-imposed restrictions on these films, and whether they should allow them just because they are profitable. A number of people, including Shojiro Goto, a lawyer who dealt with many false accusation cases, as well as Nobuyoshi Iwata, the former principal of the junior high school that Boye attended, insist that he was wrongfully accused and point out several contradictions in the statements of the investigating authorities. They point to the fact that investigators said that one of the murders was committed by a left-handed person, while Boye is right-handed. The young suspected killer had bad grades at school, and yet his confession was complex, if somewhat cryptic, and contained many elaborate figures of speech and similes, but also contained many absurd statements and claims of things that would be impossible for a 14-year-old to do. Because he confessed to his crimes, Boye was sentenced to a youth reformatory for treatment, mainly because he was under the age of 16, and so could not be tried as an adult. A change in Japan's bicameral legislature lowered the age for criminal responsibility from 16 to 14 in the year 2000. However, after the Sasebo slashing of June 1, 2004, in which Satomi Matarai by 11-year-old girl, there has been renewed discussion for the need for further revision. For many, there never any doubt about his guilt. In 2002, the boy's mother visited him in prison and asked him if he had really committed the crimes, to which he confirmed he had murdered both children. In an unprecedented act, the Japanese Ministry of Justice announced on March 11, 2004, that Sakakibara, 21 years old at that time, was to be released on a provisional basis, with a full release to follow on January 1, 2005. Because the government had taken the unusual step of notifying the public, critics have argued that it was likely Sakakibara was not fit for release and instead should be transferred to prison to serve out the remainder of his sentence. This criticism was further exacerbated some 3 months later, in the wake of the Sasebo slashing. Because he was judged to be cured of his sexual sadism and compulsion to kill, Sakakibara was released on parole in 2004. Due to the seriousness of the crimes and the fact that they had been committed by a minor, Sakakibara's name and new residence were intended to remain a highly guarded secret. However, his real name, Shinichiro Azuma, had already been leaked by the press and circulated on the internet since June 29, 1997, according to journalist Fumihiko Takayama. Originally, both the public and victims' families were notified of his release and whereabouts. However, after 2004, he was no longer required to report his location and soon dropped out of sight and from public security. Living his life largely anonymous, it wasn't until 2015 that he would again feature in the news, when he decided to release a tell-all book that would bring him back into the spotlight. On June 10, 2015, Sakakibara, then aged 32, released his controversial autobiography through Oda Publishing titled Zeka. His memoir, which served as a recollection of his crimes and time in prison, would vividly recount the murder of June Hayes, the details of which had never been reported by the media. Azuma claims to have strangled and eventually decapitated June Hayes on the slopes of a nearby mountain using a hand saw. He then carried the boy's body into the bathroom at his home, where he locked himself in and committed a deed far more heinous than murder. This deed, to which he alludes, most likely refers to the committing sexual acts with June's corpse, as Sakakibara calls himself an incorrigible sexual deviant. Around 10,000 copies of the first edition of Zeka were given the green light for publication, something the victims' families were not made aware of beforehand. The president of Oda Publishing, Satoshi Oka, said in a statement, "We have never had the opportunity to read the personal account of a juvenile criminal at this level. Although I understand this book will receive a great deal of criticism, I believe that the book details events that speak to issues of juvenile criminal accountability still relevant today." The families of the victims, specifically June Hayes' family, along with many advocates for the victims, had objected to and attempted to keep Zeka from being published, but ultimately the book was released. Despite one bookstore chain refusing to stock the book, it became an instant success and quickly reached the top of Japanese bestseller lists. The royalties from the sale of the book were to be paid to Sakakibara, something which only contributed to the outrage from the families of the victims. It was reported that Sakakibara, who is still referred to as Boya by the media and in legal documents, sent a personal note of apology attached to a copy of the copy, which he intended to be delivered to members of the bereaved families of his victims. It was reported that he now realizes the gravity of the crimes he committed as a teenager. Mamoru Hayes, the father of June Hayes, issued a statement in which he said, "I don't know if the murderer of our child published this book to further extend out endless suffering. It shows he doesn't really feel bad about doing what he did. I wish this book would be pulled immediately and that no more copies be printed." Several months later, Sakakibara set up a vanity website in which he posted bizarre photoshopped images of a nude male, whom he suggested were of himself. In response to these controversies, the tabloid newspaper Shuken Post decided to publicize Sakakibara's real, Shinichiro Azuma, along with his occupation at the time and his location. Soon afterwards, he once again faded from the public eye, despite the heinous crimes he committed, and it seems he has continued to live a normal life. Because of the callous and inhumane nature of his crimes, and the fact that he was one of the most infamous of child killers, the murders committed by Sakakibara were the primary reason why the Diet lowered the age for criminal responsibility in 2000 from 16 to 14 years of age. But it would come too late to stop his release at the age of 21, and after only 6 years he completed his rehabilitation sentence as a medical juvenile reformatory and was set free. His case sent shockwaves throughout Japanese society, and due to the similarities between his letters and those of the San Francisco Bay Killer, Sakakibara would be referred to as Zodiac 3 by some publications. Although he was caught and served a sentence for his crimes, there has been much debate about whether or not justice had actually been served, and if the murderer of 2 young children had really been punished. One thing is certain about the Sakakibara murders committed by a minor, that it was horrific and unprecedented. Case 3. On October 9, 1949, at a remote area of Griffith Park, the tattered purse of Jean Spangler was found. It was all that was left of the Hollywood actress and model, who had vanished after leaving her home in Los Angeles just 2 days previously. Among the items found in her purse was a handwritten note addressed to some called Kirk, and made mention of a doctor. It soon became apparent that the young woman had been leading a life of secrets that no one knew anything about. Police began their investigation by attempting to locate the Kirk mentioned in the note, and would eventually question a known Hollywood actor about Spangler's disappearance. But no one would be charged with any crime, and although there are many varied theories concerning her disappearance, such as a botched abortion or her alleged involvement with Los Angeles gangsters, no trace of Jean Spangler has ever been found and her mysterious disappearance remains unsolved. During the 1940s, the city of Los Angeles was a dangerous place for a young woman at night, and from 1941 onwards, there were many cases of women going missing and being murdered. One of the most high-profile of these was the brutal killing of Elizabeth Short, whose dismembered and mutilated body was found dumped on a vacant lot on January 15, 1947. In August 1949, widow and socialite Mimi Boombauer went missing. 5 days later, her handbag was found, but there was no trace of fun-loving Mimi. It was that same year when Jean Spangler vanished, leaving no trace of her whereabouts. Born in Seattle, Washington on September 2, 1923, Jean Elizabeth Spangler and her family eventually moved to California, where she attended Franklin High School in Los Angeles. As a teen, Spangler had danced with the Earl Carroll Theater and Florentine Gardens. Upon her graduation in 1941, she met Dexter Benner, a manufacturer whom she married after a whirlwind romance the following year. However, the marriage was not a happy union. Eventually, Jean filed for divorce, citing cruelty, but the couple continued their on-off relationship, and Spangler gave birth to a daughter, Christine, born April 22, 1944. Spangler soon found herself engaged in a long and bitter custody battle with her former husband over their daughter, with Banner initially granted custody of Christine in 1946. He reportedly denied Spangler the right to see her daughter. However, by 1948 the dispute was eventually decided in her favor. With her background as a dancer and model, Spangler was attempting to break into acting, and by 1949, she appeared to have succeeded in her determination to make it in Hollywood when she was cast in bit parts in several films. She also appeared as a dancer in several uncredited roles, including in Walter Lang's 1948 film When My Baby Smiles at Me, the 1949 comedy Chicken Every Sunday, Her last role would be in the musical drama Young Man with a Horn, released after her death in 1950. At the time she went missing, 27-year-old Spangler lived with her mother Florence, 5-year-old daughter Christine, brother Edward, and sister-in-law Sophie, on Colgate Avenue in the Park La Brea residential complex near Wilshire Boulevard. At around 5 p.m. on Friday, October 7, 1949, Spangler left her home in Los Angeles for what would be the last time. As her mother Florence was out of town visiting family in Louisville, Kentucky, she left her daughter with Sophie, who would later tell police that Jean told her she was meeting with Benner to discuss a late child support payment. Spangler said that after meeting with her ex-husband, she was going to work on a night shoot for a film, about which she gave no further details. She came downstairs and asked how she looked, Sophie later told reporters. She smiled at me, and then her little girl, Christine, asked where she was going. Going to work, Jean answered again, but she winked at me when she said it. It was not unusual for her to work late in the afternoon as a bit part extra involved in night shoots. Some 2 hours later, Spangler called home and spoke with Sophie to ask about her daughter and to tell her sister-in-law that she would have to work the full 8 hours and would probably not return home that evening. The following morning, October 8th, Spangler had still not returned home, and Sophie went to the police and filed a missing person report. When police questioned Benner about her statement to Sophie that she was going to meet him about his child support payments, he claimed that he had not seen his former wife for several weeks. His new wife, Lynn Lasky Benner, to whom he had been married only 1 month, corroborated his story. A saleswoman at the farmer's market, only a few blocks from Spangler's home, recalled seeing her browsing around 6 p.m. and noted that she appeared to be waiting for someone. Though Spangler had told her sister-in-law that she was going to work on a film set after she met with Benner, police checked with Screen Extras Guild, who confirmed to investigators that Spangler had no call for work that night, as well as the TV studios, who stated they had no record of her employment that night. On October 9, 1949, 2 days after she vanished, Spangler's purse was found by Griffith Park employee Henry Angu, near the Ferndale entrance of Griffith Park in Los Angeles, situated approximately 5.5 miles from her family home. Hoping to find further evidence at the park, a group of 60 police officers and over 100 volunteers searched the 4,107-acre natural terrain park, but no other clues were found that might indicate what happened to Jean Spangler. The purse was the only piece of evidence found by police, and beyond this last physical remnant, no trace of Spangler could be found. Alarmingly, both of the straps on one side of the purse were torn loose, as if it had been ripped from her arm. There was no money in the purse, and Sophie told detectives that her sister-in-law had no money when she left her house the evening of her disappearance, and so the police ruled out robbery as a motive. Over the course of the following week, Griffith Park was searched by over 200 volunteers and law enforcement, and during the search, one volunteer's dog dug up a denim Los Angeles County Jail uniform in a shallow hole, but no other belongings of Spangler were found. Because murders of wives are most often than not committed by a person close to the victim, be that a partner, lover, spouse, or ex-spouse, many suspected for a time that Dexter Benner murdered his ex-wife in a case of the husband did it. In the case of Jean Spangler, the person who had the most to gain from her death was her ex-husband, Benner, who once had sole custody of their daughter, and according to those close to the family, wanted that returned. At the time she missing, police apparently questioned Benner, who said he hadn't seen Spangler for several weeks. On October 27, 1949, Benner had been awarded temporary custody of his daughter in a court battle with Spangler's mother Florence, to whom he denied visitation with Christine, because he said she was upsetting his daughter by referring to her missing daughter, and also defied a court order that he permit Spangler's mother to visit the child. When he was ordered to serve 15 days in jail for being in contempt of court, the remarried Benner fled Los Angeles with his daughter, later settling in Florida. Once Benner was cleared as a person of interest, investigators moved on to other suspects, but with little evidence surrounding her death, there were few clues as to whom might have caused her disappearance. At the time she missing, police apparently questioned Benner, who said he hadn't seen Spangler for several weeks. On October 27, 1949, Benner had been awarded temporary custody of his daughter in a court battle with Spangler's mother Florence, to whom he denied visitation with Christine, because he said she was upsetting his daughter by referring to her missing daughter, and also defied a court order that he permit Spangler's mother to visit the child. When he was ordered to serve 15 days in jail for being in contempt of court, the remarried Benner fled Los Angeles with his daughter, later settling in Florida. Once Benner was cleared as a person of interest, investigators moved on to other suspects, but with little evidence surrounding her death, there were few clues as to whom might have caused her disappearance. Attempts were made to locate the Dr. Scott referenced in the note, but Spangler's sister-in-law did not recognize the name. At a press conference, Detective Lieutenant Harry Didion did confirm the existence of a physician named Scott, explaining that he was known to Miss Spangler and her coterie of nightclubbing friends. However, police questioned every doctor with the last name Scott in Los Angeles, but none of them had a patient with the last name Spangler or Benner, her married name. The Scott identified in her life was an abusive man she called Scotty, who had been an Army Air Corps lieutenant with whom Spangler had once been involved with, but it was unknown if that was his surname or a nickname. Spangler had allegedly had an affair with the man while her husband was overseas, and told a friend that Scotty had threatened her when she left him. But according to her lawyer, she had not seen him since 1945. With regards to the mysterious Kirk mentioned in Spangler's note, police were equally baffled. When Spangler's mother, Florence, returned to Los Angeles, she told police that someone named Kirk had picked up Jean at her house twice but stayed in his car and did not come in. The only other Kirk was possibly the best-known movie star in the country. With Hollywood film sets, parties and the nightclubs, a wide variety of individuals are all brought together and in and out of Spangler's life. Investigators believed that if they looked most closely at her working relationships, romances and interactions, it might give an insight into any potential motives, as well as opportunities for committing murder. At the time she disappeared, Spangler had recently completed filming a bit part in the film Young Man with a horn starring Kirk Douglas. This soon led to public speculation that he was the Kirk mentioned in the note found in her purse. Upon reading about the discovery of the note, Douglas spoke with police over the phone while vacationing in Palm Springs and denied that he knew Spangler. On October 12, 1949, Douglas gave a formal press statement in which he said, "I told Detective Chief Thad Brown that I didn't remember the girl or the name until a friend recalled it was she who worked as an extra in a scene with me in my picture Young Man with a Horn." Douglas was quoted in the October 13, 1949 issue of the San Bernardino Sun as saying, "Then I recalled that she was a tall girl in a green dress. I talked and kidded with her a bit on the set, but I never saw her before or after that and have never been out with her." Throughout his career, rumors persisted that Kirk Douglas had raped aspiring actress Natalie Wood, who was 16 years old at the time, during an audition at the Chateau Marmont during the summer of 1955. The alleged attack went on for hours and was described as brutal and violent. Spangler had also told her friend, actor Robert Cummings, that she was having a casual affair at the time, but did not reveal the identity of the man. When Cummings asked her if it was serious, she responded, "No, but I'm having the time of my life." Spangler's girlfriends with whom she regularly attended nightclubs told police that she was 3 months pregnant when she disappeared and that she had talked about having an abortion, which at the time was illegal. Witnesses, who frequented the same nightclubs and bars as Spangler, told police they had heard of a former medical student known as Doc, who performed abortions for money, but this individual could not be located, nor could investigators prove that he existed. The theory that Spangler disappeared under circumstances related to a botched abortion attempt was investigated by the Los Angeles Police Department, as well as a potential connection to the series of murders that had occurred in the Los Angeles area. Spangler's mother begged the media to help find her daughter and offered a $1,000 reward to anyone with information about her whereabouts. The disappearance has remained an unsolved missing persons case and was never officially designated a homicide. At the time, some newspapers reported that Spangler was feared to be one of several female victims in a series of killings in Los Angeles, potentially linked to the Black Dahlia murder in 1947. Retired LAPD Detective Rick Jackson worked the case during his many years on the force, largely because of his interest in its possible connection to the Black Dahlia murder. Although there was no formal case file on Spangler's disappearance, Jackson kept a notebook he made of documents related to the case. His former partner, Detective Elizabeth Camacho, confirmed that no case file remains. "Forensically, I don't think anything was ever uncovered," she said, noting that a murder report was never filed. It was always a suspicious missing person case. Because the disappearance was classified as such, Any and all existing evidence was likely discarded over the past decades, including the purse, which Jackson claims he never saw outside of in photographs. Former LAPD homicide detective Steve Hodel has claimed that his father, the deceased Dr. George Hodel, was responsible for the disappearance of Jean Spangler, as well as a series of other murders throughout Los Angeles. In his book Black Dahlia Avenger, Hodel put forward his theory that his father had committed the brutal 1947 slaying of Elizabeth Short, as well as the murders of Jean French in 1947 and Gladys Kern in 1948, along with several others and Jean Spangler. Her purse, the only piece of evidence in the case, was found approximately a quarter of a mile from Dr. Hodel's residence, the Franklin House, in the Los Feliz neighborhood of Los Angeles. Hodel also recalls how his half-brother Duncan once said, "I remember one of the girls Dad was dating back then was a drop-dead gorgeous actress by the name of Jean." It is the theory of Steve Hodel that his father was with Spangler on the night of her disappearance, and believes she may have made the mistake of threatening to reveal what she knew or suspected of him to the police. Jean Spangler was last seen in public at a Hollywood restaurant, arguing with a man whose description matched that of George Hodel. This was the final sighting of Spangler during the early morning hours of October 8th. A popular radio DJ of the era, Al the Chic Laser, who conducted tableside interviews, reported seeing Spangler at a Sunset Strip restaurant at about 2:30 a.m. She appeared to be arguing with two men, and when Laser approached the table, the men waved him away. Similarly, the proprietor of the restaurant, Terry Taylor, also reported seeing Spangler earlier that evening, at a front table with a man he described as a clean-cut fellow about 30 or 35. This incident occurred on October 7, 1949, just 1 week before Hodel was formally arraigned on felony charges that could see him serve decades in prison. Dr. Hodel's arrest resulted from the accusation he had molested and impregnated his 14-year-old daughter, Tamar Hodel, after which she claimed she was given a back-alley abortion. Steve Hodel said of his father, he was performing abortions for the rich and famous, and a lot of police officers if their girls got in trouble. He believes the mysterious Dr. Scott was another member of his father's abortion ring, which was headed by a Dr. Audrain and made up of physicians who paid hush money to the police. Hodel contends that the LAPD of the 1940s was the real-life LA Confidential back then. A station attendant named Art Rogers told police that on the same evening Spangler had been seen at a Hollywood restaurant. He saw a man and a woman matching Spangler's description who came to the gas station that night near the Sunset Strip. The man bought gas and Rogers the couple were headed to Fresno, but as they drove off, the woman, who shrank down in the passenger seat, cried out, "Have the police follow this car." Rogers called police, but by the time they were on the scene, the vehicle and its occupants were long gone. Hodel believes it was his father who was spotted with Spangler. He fits the description of the man spotted with her, and he drove a 1936 black Packard sedan resembling the one Rogers described. This same vehicle also matches descriptions of cars seen leaving the Elizabeth Short crime scene in 1947. At the time, the Los Angeles Examiner printed a map with the headline "Black Sedan Hunted in LA as Death Car." It is the firm conviction of Steve Hodel that it was his father who was seen with Spangler the night she went missing. "It's my belief she started dating Dad either late September or early October," he said. In his pursuit of the truth about his father, Hodel was given clearance to search the Franklin house in 2012 in an attempt to locate forensic evidence. A trained dog indicated the smell of human remains in the basement and the slope behind the house, and soil samples recovered identified the presence of human remains in the soil. During the 1940s, the mobster Mickey Cohen held a tight grip over the criminal underworld in Los Angeles. Investigators explored the theory that Spangler's disappearance was related to Los Angeles gangsters with whom she purportedly was associated. She was known to have worked for a time as a dancer at Florentine Gardens, a nightclub owned by Mark Hansen and Nils Thor Granlund. Incidentally, Hansen was considered a suspect in the murder of Elizabeth Short, and was known to have been the last person to have spoken with her in the days leading up to her brutal death. It was Spangler's acquaintance with Hansen that might have led to an association with various mob affiliates, including bootlegger and gambling entrepreneur Anthony Cornero Strala and Mickey Cohen, a violent gangster who worked on behalf of Al Capone's Chicago outfit and Bugsy Siegel. It's been alleged that Spangler had been seen with Little Davy Ogle, an associate of Cohen's, in Palm Springs, as well as in Las Vegas, Nevada with Ogle and Frank Nicoli, another Cohen associate. In September 1949, Nicole disappeared after having been indicted on conspiracy charges. On October 9, 1949, 2 days after Spangler went missing, Ogle disappeared. This led police to investigate the possibility that Spangler and Ogle, who was also under indictment for conspiracy, had fled to avoid prosecution. Thomas Ellery Evans, a gangster and acquaintance of Ogle, was interrogated by police during their investigation. In April 1950, Spangler's sister Betsy testified that neither she nor her sister were ever acquainted with Ogle, Cohen, or any of his associates. That same year, a customs agent in El Paso, Texas reported seeing Ogle and a woman who looked like Spangler in a local hotel. The hotel clerk identified Spangler from a photograph, but neither Ogle nor Spangler's names appeared on the hotel register. Because her life and career were tragically cut short, Jean Spangler never quite reached that level of success she craved in Hollywood. A young and talented woman and aspiring starlet who sought fame and fortune, but instead found her name immortalized through tragedy. The LAPD continued the search and circulated Spangler's picture for several years, and she is still listed as a missing person, and the LAPD has not closed the case. Until evidence is uncovered that reveals exactly what happened to her and why she went missing, the disappearance of Jean Spangler will continue to haunt the City of Angels. Case 4. In October 1975, the Canadian slasher film Black Christmas was released in Toronto cinemas for the Halloween season. Directed by Bob Clark, the story involves a group of sorority sisters who receive threatening phone calls and are one by one stalked and murdered by a deranged maniac during the Christmas holidays. Upon its release, the film received mixed reviews and performed poorly at the box office, but in the decades since has enjoyed renewed interest and a much-deserved critical reappraisal. Black Christmas is considered one of the earliest slasher films that went on to influence many other cult movie franchises. Inspired by an old urban legend which dates back to the 1960s about a teenaged girl babysitting children who is continually harassed by a stalker, and in some versions of the tale, is murdered by the unseen prowler, Black Christmas was, however, based on a real-life incident from Montreal, Quebec, during the Second World War. Originally developed by Canadian screenwriter Roy Moore, under the title Stop Me, Black Christmas found inspiration from the urban legend known as the Babysitter and the Man Upstairs, which had become widespread by the 1970s. The tale had originated in the 1960s and revolves around a teenaged girl babysitting children who receives telephone calls from a stalker who continually asks her to check the children. This basic story had been adapted numerous times, and it itself based on the March 1950 murder of 13-year-old babysitter Janet Christman, who was brutally murdered and sexually assaulted by an unknown killer. Moore had also been inspired when writing his screenplay by a crime that happened in November 1943. In a quiet and leafy suburb of Westmount in Montreal, and family was bludgeoned by a maniac intent on killing the entire family. When police arrived, alerted by a survivor, Mrs. Webster was found beaten to death at the hands of her teenaged son. The young boy, George Webster, had also used a baseball bat to beat his 2 younger siblings, as well as a visiting Australian woman. At the time, the case received little coverage, owing to the ongoing conflict throughout the world, and was quickly forgotten by most. The film's producers ordered a rewrite of the original screenplay, in order to give it a university setting, and several alterations were made by Clark to the dialogue, who thought it was too much of a straightforward slasher film, and incorporated some humorous elements to give it more light-hearted moments. Filming began in 1973 on a budget of $620,000. Olivia Hussey was cast as the main character Jess, who considered it a wise career choice and accepted the role after being told by a psychic that she would make a film in Canada that would earn a great deal of money. Based on his performance in the sci-fi epic 2001, A Space Odyssey, Keir Dullea was cast as Peter, the boyfriend of Jess. In supporting role, Margot Kidder played Barb, one of the sorority sisters, alongside John Saxton, who played Lieutenant Ken Fuller. For the part of the film's antagonist, Italian-American actor Nick Mancuso was cast as one of the main voices for the phone call sequences. In order to experience Mancuso as the deranged character of Billy, Clark had him sit in a chair facing away from him during the audition, so as not to see the actor's face. The film opens with an unseen man climbing the exterior of a sorority house, where a Christmas party is being held, whereupon he enters the attic unseen. Inside the house phone rings and is answered by Jess, played by Olivia Hussey. She discovers it is an obscene phone call from a person who has called before. She calls to the other sorority girls, who all listen as the caller rants in strange voices. Lick it, lick it, lick it. Let me lick your pretty pinky cunt. Barb, one of the sorority girls played by Margot Kidder, insults the caller, who in turn promises, I'm going to kill you. A younger student, Claire Harrison, suggests that the caller could be dangerous and says, I really don't think you should provoke somebody like that, Barb. Claire then replies, oh listen, this guy is minor league. In the city, I get 2 of those a day. Claire then returns to her bedroom, where the intruder suffocates her with a plastic dress bag and moves her body to the attic. When the telephone rings again, it is Peter, the boyfriend of Jess, and the two agree to talk in person the following day. The following morning, Mr. Harrison, played by James Edmond, arrives at the Pi Kappa Sigma sorority house to pick up his daughter, but she fails to show. He talks with Mrs. McHenry, the house mother, who tells him Claire is most likely at the fraternity common room, and he agrees to drive her there. Jess meets with Peter and explains that she is pregnant but planning to get an abortion. This angers Peter, and they agree to discuss it later. Later that evening, the telephone rings once more, answered again by Jess. The caller shouts out the name Billy, and then talks in different voices while referring to Agnes and Billy. Jess hangs up abruptly. The next day, Mr. Harrison and 2 of the sorority sisters are in town attempting to report Claire as missing, but the desk sergeant doesn't take the report seriously. Jess talks with Chris Hayden, who says he hasn't seen Claire since the previous night. At the police station, Chris and Jess learn that a young local girl has also vanished while walking home from school. Back at the sorority house, after telling a drunken and argumentative Barb to go to bed, Mr. Harrison, Chris, Jess, and Phil go outside to help search for the missing girl. The police have organized a search of the park for the 2 missing girls, comprising of several dozen locals under the direction of Lieutenant Ken Fuller, played by John Saxon. Meanwhile, the house mother, Mrs. McHenry, enters the attic in search of Claude the cat and discovers Claire's body. The killer, hidden from view, throws a crane hook into her face, hanging and killing her, before manically trashing the attic in a rage. In the park, members of the search party find the missing girl's disfigured body. Back at the sorority house, Jess answers another obscene phone call, with the caller wailing and whimpering, "Please stop me," and screams the name Billy again. "I know what you did, Billy, filthy Billy." She tries to find the house mother, without success, and calls to file a report with the police, only for Peter to surprise her by jumping out from behind, emerging from upstairs. She tells him that a young girl was found murdered in the park, and that Claire is still missing. He tells her he is quitting and leaving, and attempts to persuade her into marriage, but she refuses and reaffirms her decision to have an abortion. He threatens that she will be sorry if she goes ahead with the abortion. As Peter leaves angrily, Lieutenant Fuller arrives with a telephone lineman to bug the phone. Fuller requests to see Claire's room, where he asks them questions about Claire's boyfriend Chris Hayden, and if she had any emotional problems. The police leave a marked police car outside the sorority house. After Fuller leaves, the deranged killer talks incoherently to Claire's corpse in the attic. Jess goes to help Barb after she wakes screaming after having a nightmare and suffers an asthma attack. While carol singers are outside, the killer moves to Barb's bedroom and their murders, stabbing her to death with a glass figurine. Jess experiences another unnerving phone call, in which the caller restates part of the argument she previously had with Peter. Lieutenant Fuller calls her to say the attempt to trace the call failed, and asks her about her boyfriend Peter. When talking to Phil, Jess worries that Peter could be responsible, but refuses to believe it. The killer calls again, this time pretending to be Peter, but the call is too short to be traced. Lieutenant Fuller asks Jess about the abortion, and theorizes that Peter could be the prank caller. Phil goes to her room, and is the next to be murdered. Jess gets another phone call, in which the killer alludes to some sort of transgression between 2 children named Agnes and Billy. This time the call is long enough to be traced, and Lieutenant Fuller attempts to contact the officer outside the sorority house, but he has been murdered. Sergeant Nash then instructs Jess to leave the house immediately, as the calls are coming from within the house. Concerned for the welfare of Barb and Phil, she ventures upstairs, where she discovers their bodies. Jess sees the killer for the first time, as he peers through the crack in the doorway, in one of the most iconic scenes of the movie. The killer then pursues her, but she manages to fight him off. Jess runs to the cellar and locks herself in, only for Peter to appear outside one of the windows. He smashes the window, enters the basement, and approaches Jess. The police arrive and hear Jess screaming, then discover her barely conscious in the basement with Peter's bloody body next to her. Believing that Peter was the killer, they put Jess to bed in her room and leave her alone in the house, with a policeman standing guard outside. Reports arrive, and Lieutenant Fuller refuses to give any details of what went on at the sorority house. Mr. Harrison faints from shock and is taken to the hospital by police. As the sound of sirens disappear in the distance, the killer's voice is heard from the attic, implying that he is still alive. The still undiscovered bodies of Claire and Mrs. McHenry are seen through the attic window before the house's telephone begins to ring, leaving both Jess' fate ambiguous and the identity of the killer a mystery. The film debuted in October 1974 in Toronto, Canada. In the United States, the film originally screened in July 1975 in Virginia under the title Silent Night, Evil Night, which had been initially changed by the film's distributor Warner Bros., thinking it would mislead audiences into believing the film was a blaxploitation movie. The film later screened in October 1975 in New York and Chicago, as well as several theaters in Los Angeles. Owing to poor takings, the film was pulled from cinemas in December 1975. Although it opened to mixed reviews, the film eventually earned around $4.1 million internationally. Upon its release, the movie garnered some negative reviews that focused on the story, with one review calling it slow-paced, while another referred to it as a routine shocker. The lack of a conclusion of the story was cited by many as the reason why audiences did not enjoy the film, with one reviewer stating, "It may well be that the makers simply couldn't figure out how to end it." The film's writers have since explained that they never intended for the killer's identity to be revealed, and intentionally omitted it in an effort to make him more frightening. Neither the character nor his portrayers were ever listed in the end credits, and as a result, fans of the film began referring to the killer as Billy, with director Bob Clark himself using the name when referring to the character during interviews. As such, the character of Billy has become a faceless killer, and by making him more enigmatic, it allows the audience to project their own fears onto the character, and thereby forming their own interpretations about him and his motivations. As a result, Billy is considered the primary influence on later horror characters of slasher movies, such as Michael Myers of John Carpenter's 1978 film Halloween. The film Black Christmas, under the title Stranger in the House, was scheduled to make its network television premiere on January 28, 1978, on NBC's weekly segment, Saturday Night at the Movies. However, 2 weeks before it was due to air, a crime eerily similar to the murders depicted in Black Christmas occurred. The Chi Omega sorority house on the Tallahassee campus of Florida State University was the scene of a brutal double murder, in which 2 Chi Omega sisters were bludgeoned to death while asleep in their beds. The killer then went to a nearby room of the sorority house and violently attacked 2 more sleeping students who survived. On January 15, 1978, a man entered the Chi Omega sorority house at around 2:45 a.m. and bludgeoned 21-year-old Margaret Bowman with a piece of oak firewood and then strangled her with a stocking. He then went to the room of 20-year-old Lisa Levy and beat her unconscious, breaking her collarbone. One of her nipples was torn off, she was bitten on the buttocks, then sexually assaulted with a Clariol hairspray bottle and strangled with a stocking. The intruder then entered the adjoining bedroom, occupied by 20-year-old Kathy Kleiner and her roommate, 21-year-old Karen Chandler, both of whom were sleeping soundly in their beds. The man assaulted Kleiner, breaking her jawbone and lacerating her shoulder, and then struck Chandler, who suffered a concussion and lost several teeth because her jaw had been broken in 3 places. When the headlights of a car which was dropping off housemate Nita Neary illuminated the sorority house, the man became startled and made his escape. The attacks had been overheard by several of the other girls in the house, who alerted the dorm mother and notified the police that an intruder was inside the residence. Karen Chandler staggered out of her room and into the hallway, with blood seeping from a head wound. Then Lisa Levy and Margaret Bowman were found dead in their beds, having suffered gruesome injuries. Although they survived, Karen Chandler and Kathy Kleiner had suffered life-changing injuries. The attacker had escaped the scene, but made his way to a basement apartment 8 blocks away, and there launched a final attack, this time on 21-year-old student Cheryl Thomas. She was found lying diagonally across her bed, her face turning purple with bruises and barely conscious, whimpering in pain. She had been beaten across the head and suffered a broken jaw and dislocated shoulder, whilst her skull was fractured in 5 places. Next to her body, police found a semen stain and a pantyhose mask which contained 2 hairs. Cheryl Thomas suffered the worst injuries that night and was left with permanent deafness and equilibrium damage which ruined her dance prospects and would stay in hospital for a month. The perpetrator of these crimes would later be revealed as serial killer Ted Bundy, who had escaped custody for the second time on December 31st, 1977, from the jail in Glenwood Springs, Colorado. He made his way to Florida, where he rented a room under the assumed name Chris Hagen, a name that is suspiciously similar to that of a character in Black Christmas, Chris Hayden, played by Art Hindle. There he began roaming the nearby campuses, which were his old hunting grounds back in Washington. He was wanted for the murders of several women from that state, as well as Utah. Bundy would eventually stand trial for the Chi Omega killings and was sentenced to death. He was also charged with the murder of a 12-year-old girl, for which he would eventually be executed. These were among the last crimes attributed to Bundy, and they bear a striking resemblance to the murders committed by Billy, the killer from Black Christmas. Bundy had moved around the sorority house, attacking several of the sorority sisters and killing 2. It is possible that during its initial release, Bundy had seen the film and it made a lasting impression upon him, compelling him to commit similar crimes during his last few desperate weeks on the run from law enforcement and soon to be the focus of an FBI manhunt. There have been several co-ed killers, such as Ed Kemper, who kidnapped female hitchhikers and college-aged girls between May 1972 and April 1973, and the Gainesville Ripper, who entered the apartments of students from Santa Fe College during a burglary and robbery spree that saw him murder as many as 7 women and 1 man. Case 5. At the end of November 1968, an accident occurred at number 2123 Center Street in Salem, Oregon, when a car crashed into the house, causing damage to the side of the property. The homeowner, Jerry Brudos, was away for a few days with his family, and although the police came to investigate, they nor anyone else attempted to look inside through the large hole caused by the crash. Had they done so, they would have found a dead body hanging by the neck from the ceiling, the second victim of a fledgling serial killer. Known as the Lust Killer and the Shoe Fetish Slayer, Jerry Brudos suffered deep emotional and physical abuse as a child, while also developing a psychological fascination for women's shoes from a young age. This fetish would escalate in his adult years, and along with the trauma of his childhood, would become the catalyst for his murder spree that would claim the lives of 4 young women, who found themselves at the mercy of a deranged serial killer and necrophile. From January 1968 to March 1969, 3 young women had vanished under mysterious circumstances. The first time anyone suspected foul play was in April 1969, when several incidents happened that led police to believe that a suspect was accosting young women with the intention of abducting them. Although the 2 victims described different experiences, one thing connected, that of a similar description of the offender. Late in the afternoon of April 21st, 1969, a young woman left her secretarial job in Portland. 24-year-old Sharon Wood was heading to meet with her estranged husband, who wanted to discuss a divorce. As she entered the basement level of a parking garage to look for her car, a tall, pudgy man approached her. As described in Rule's book The Lust Killer, she later told police that she had sensed someone behind her and had tried to return to an area where she could hear other people. But in that moment someone tapped her shoulder, and she turned around to see a man holding a pistol. He told her not to scream, but faced with this sudden encounter, she became both frightened and enraged. In a matter of seconds, she decided there and then to fight. She screamed and stepped away from him, and he grabbed her and put an arm lock around her throat. He was much taller than she, and outweighed her by nearly 100 pounds. She stood barely a chance against him, but believed that someone might still hear her, and if she failed to struggle, this man might kill her. Her instincts told her that this man had only murderous intentions. Sharon Woods kicked at him with her high-heeled shoes and screamed again, hoping to attract someone's attention to the danger she was in. She also grabbed the gun and gave it a hard twist. When the man tried to silence her with his hand, she bit him hard. She knew that she'd drawn blood, and he tried to free himself, but could not, so now her attacker was struggling. Grabbing her hair, he tried to force her to the floor, but she continued to resist with all her strength. She was determined that this man was not going to assault her, but he was stronger and managed to slam her head on the concrete, dazing her. She relaxed her jaw and let him go, and as they stood there post-struggle, she then heard another car coming, and her attacker picked up the gun he'd dropped and left. This was all she could remember. Someone had apparently called the police, and Sharon found herself giving her statement to police. Her attacker was a tall man with blue eyes and freckles, she recalled, but knew little else. She said she'd know him if she saw him again, but when the police questioned others in the area, no one recalled a man by that description. Sharon learned only later that this man's frustrated attempt to abduct her had only shifted his modus operandi. He would from then on be more careful in approaching women, and strengthened his resolve to not be caught. Sharon Wood survived, but not long afterward another young woman would not. Rule had some measure of success with her memoir, The Stranger Beside Me, about serial killer Ted Bundy, and she'd been writing articles under the pseudonym Andy Stack. Her literary agent then advised her to continue with her pseudonym for the next 3 books. When those came out, The Stranger Beside Me was doing very well, Rule explained. So my agent said that these books got such small advances I should not put my name on them. I stayed with Andy Stack, but after a while I put them under my real name, she adds. Rule explains in The Lust Killer that her purpose in writing such a book was to add to the psychiatric research that may one day to treat aberrant minds before they explode into violence. She believes that the more we learn about such offenders, the better our chances for stopping them. At the time of these crimes, little was known about truly deviant serial behavior. A murder spree was occurring simultaneously in Michigan with 8 dead students, and both the Manson family murders and the Zodiac's deadly and bizarre killing spree would soon begin in California. Meanwhile, Albert DeSalvo, the alleged Boston Strangler, had been interrogated for years earlier. The murders began in January 1968, when 19-year-old Linda Slauson, a door-to-door encyclopedia saleswoman who worked for a book company, was going door-to-door to persuade families to purchase sets of encyclopedias. On that day, January 26th, her route had taken her to a neighborhood in Portland, Oregon. At some accounts, she was looking for another house when she went there, but only one person knows what truly happened that day. It was the last anyone saw or heard from Linda Slauson again. The book company that employed her had no record of where she had been that day, so the many desperate requests to police from Slauson's family came to nothing. The police did manage to locate her car, which had been abandoned, but it offered no clues of what had become of her. There was no sign of struggle, nothing apparently missing. She had just vanished. Slauson remained on the list, but as each day passed, her case grew colder. Other more pressing incidents took precedence. If she had been abducted, the person responsible had been careful, leaving little evidence, no sign of his presence, his intentions, or what he had done with her. The mystery would remain, until it was revived later the same year, when other young women turned up missing. Jan Whitney, 23, disappeared as she was on her way home for the Thanksgiving holiday on November 26, 1968. Her Rambler was found off the highway in a rest area near Albany, Oregon. It was locked, but there was no sign of January. It was suspected that a minor mechanical fault might have compelled her to look for a ride from someone, possibly the wrong person. It was during the time when girls freely hitchhiked along the West Coast. Some 4 months later, on March 27, 1969, 19-year-old Karen Sprinker went missing. She had been home from college, and her mother had expected to meet her for lunch at a downtown restaurant. Her mother waited for an hour, and then became worried as Karen would not have missed this meeting. In fact, it was later learned that she did park her car at the garage of the store where her mother was waiting. But the car sat empty, and Karen never returned to claim it. Several shoppers in the area described seeing a very tall and strange-looking woman in the area. One eyewitness said that when this person got close to her, she saw that it was in fact a man in drag. He seemed fairly creepy, so people had avoided him. There was no reason then to link him to this incident, but in retrospect, it was all part of the mystery. Only 4 weeks later, it appeared that 22-year-old Linda Sally had been abducted from a shopping mall under similar circumstances. She had visited there to buy a gift for her boyfriend, but had failed to meet him later that evening. She also did not show up to work, and her car was found abandoned. Like the others young women, there was no sign of any violence inside the car, or any that a stranger had entered it. As a matter of routine procedure, her boyfriend was checked out, but nothing indicated that he should be considered a suspect. In the days following her disappearance, no sign of Sally turned up. There were simply no leads, like Karen Sprinker and Jan Whitney. She was just gone. Investigators wondered if there was any connection between these girls, and some even brought up the case of Linda Slauson, the encyclopedia salesperson. Detectives soon saw that a pattern began to emerge. When they collated all the timelines, they noted the fact that all of the girls had disappeared toward the latter half of each month. Additionally, all of the missing were young white females. But that was as much as the investigators had managed to uncover. That is, until human remains were found in a nearby river. 3 weeks after Linda Sally's disappearance, a man who'd gone fishing that May in the Long Tom River, south of Corvallis, Oregon, found decomposing human remains bobbing in the rushing current. He called police, and when they arrived, they discovered that the deceased was a female who had been bound to a car transmission box with nylon rope and copper wire which weighed down the body, making it difficult to pull out. But this grim find provided clear proof of murder and an attempt to conceal it, along with possible evidence to tie back to a suspect, should they find one. Also, this victim had been tied to the auto part with a nylon rope, and a rather specific type of knot had been used. Police cut the cord carefully so they could preserve the knot, just in case they had reason to use it as probable cause for a warrant or later in court. The copper wire, too, had been twisted in a specific manner that indicated someone with background as an electrician. With so little evidence, it was difficult for the medical examiner to determine the exact cause of death, but from the condition of the neck area, it appeared that she had been strangled. Oddly, there was also a pair of post-mortem punctures, each circled by a burn, at opposite sides of the rib cage that appeared to have been caused by a needle. No one knew what had caused them, but when dental records were checked it was determined that the remains were those of Linda Sally. Further searches were undertaken along the river, and a few days later they came across yet another set of decomposing remains, also bound to something that turned out to be an engine head. Once again, the same type of bindings and knots were found with this victim. This was a clear enough indication that the same offender was responsible for both. The latest victim had also been strangled, apparently with a strap that had been used as a garrote. The clothing still on her body matched those Karen Sprinker's mother had described her wearing the day she went missing. But once the body was lifted, it was found she was also clothed in a long-line black brassiere that appeared much too large to be hers. This anomaly had been confirmed by her mother. Stranger still, it had been padded with brown paper towels. In fact, this victim's breasts had been completely removed, and the padding appeared to have been placed there to absorb the blood and fluid. Further searches along the river yielded nothing more, while investigators had been hoping that this effort might close the case on the other 2 missing women. What investigators knew at this point was they were looking for either a rather strong male or 2 men working as a team, because the bodies, coupled with the weights, would have been quite heavy to carry. Because of Sprinker's college background, the police decided to question students on the Oregon State University campus in Corvallis, something that would prove to fortuitous in their search for answers. When detectives questioned the students at OSU, they learned that some of the female students had recently complained about getting strange calls from a man who attempted to lure them out. They also found reports of a suspicious red-haired man, described as somewhat pudgy, loitering around campus. But it would be one account that proved to be the most promising lead. One young woman had actually ventured out on a brief date with a man who claimed to be a lonely Vietnam veteran looking for company. Detectives thought this sounded promising. This girl told police she had no intention of seeing the man again, having found him to be a bit disconcerting, not to mention that he had wanted to discuss the recent discovery of bodies in the river. But detectives asked her to contact them should he call again. It was most likely the fact that the man had actually asked her why she wasn't afraid he might strangle her alerted police to his odd curiosity. Most intriguingly, it was her description of a tall man with light-colored hair and a lot of freckles that proved similar to those given by women who had nearly been abducted in recent days. Police hoped he would contact this young woman again, and to her surprise, he did. She promptly set a date for an hour's time and then phoned the police. When they went to the designated meeting place, they spotted a tall, pudgy man enter. Upon approaching him, they learned that his name was Jerry Brudos. While they believed he was a potential suspect, he seemed completely at ease, as if he had nothing untoward to hide. This might be evidence of his innocence, or that he was equally as clever, arrogant, and without remorse for his misdeeds. As they had nothing with which to detain him, they decided to keep him under surveillance. Having learned where he lived in the area, along with the significant fact that he had worked as an electrician, detectives set out to research his background and find out everything they could about this possible suspect. Within 5 days, as the many coincidences began to pile up, they finally decided to arrest Brudos. Born on January 31, 1939, in South Dakota, The parents of Jerome Henry Brudos had traveled around the country for some years before finally ending up in Oregon. By all accounts, his mother had not wanted him after already having had 2 boys, and apparently had hoped for a girl. She treated her third-born son with criticism and disdain. Often spending his time alone, Brudos developed a fantasy life and habits that by the age of 17 got him in trouble with the law. These generally involved a sexual fetish for women's shoes and underclothing. Harold Schechter explains in his book The Serial Killer Files. Exactly how Brudos became a foot fetishist is a mystery. One thing is certain, however. He began to manifest the obsession at a startlingly early age. His discovery of a pair of women's spike-heeled shoes at a local dump when he was 5 years old was most likely the starting point. However, it was likely not due to the shoes themselves, but was more his mother's strong reaction to seeing him wearing them in his bedroom. She instantly grabbed them, destroyed them, and told him in no uncertain terms that such things were wicked. She began highly agitated and inexplicably upset by the incident, which signaled to the boy that there was something about those shoes that was mysteriously forbidden. It's likely that making these shoes off limits attached to women's high-heeled shoes in general created a taboo that influenced Jerry Brudos' developing sexuality. He once stole the shoes that his kindergarten teacher kept in her desk and received a stern reprimand. Most authors agree that as Brudos matured, his developing shoe fetish increasingly provided sexual arousal, something the psychologists who later analyzed him tended to agree with. He continued to collect shoes in secret, hiding them from his mother's disapproval and eventually adding to that stash an assorted collection of women's underwear, which he had stolen during clandestine raids into nearby houses. When touching female underwear, he gained some sense of comfort and the feeling of arousal. It was this unusual feeling that Brudos could no understand of explain, but desired. By 1956, at the age of 17, Jerry Brudos' fetish burgeoned into a dangerous addiction. One day he dug a hole in a hillside where he planned to keep girls as sex slaves, and used a knife to accost a 17-year-old girl, demanding that she remove her clothing so he could photograph her nude body. He even beat her with his fists, but after an elderly couple caught him, he admitted what he had done. But this failed encounter would not satisfy his urges. Even spending 9 months for it on the psychiatric ward of Oregon State Hospital didn't deter the schoolboy kidnapper. In therapy there, doctors pinpointed the source of his sexual fantasies that were centered around hatred for his demanding mother and revenge against women in general. They were also made aware of his collection of women's clothing. As one author stated, his fantasies included placing kidnapped girls into freezers so he could later arrange their stiff bodies in sexually explicit poses. In her book, Rule includes the psychiatric report from that hospital, explaining that the examining mental health staff did not believe Brudos was grossly mentally ill. It appeared he had what was described as an adjustment reaction to adolescence and was not considered dangerous. However, he had developed a fetish for female shoes and underwear, and for nude female photographs. For his age, he seemed immature and unable to deal normally with his developing sexuality. But that did not explain his readily accepted use of violence. As Rule explained, the doctors believed that he simply had to grow up. This grossly underestimated assessment is in part to the period. For not much was known in 1956 about the development of serial sexual predators. An older Brudos went into the military, but was discharged early because of his strange delusions, described as sexual obsessions by others. A civilian again, he became an electronics technician, something for which he possessed an aptitude. In 1961, at the age 22, he met Ralphine, a shy 17-year-old girl, referred to as Darcy by Rule. In an attempt to please him, she went along with whatever Brudos wanted, including staying naked in the house, staying out of his workshop, and avoiding the attic. They had 2 children together, and eventually Ralphine declined to have sex any longer. Although she could sense unusual ways in his character, she seemed not to notice when Brudos stole out during the night to invade other people's homes to satisfy his underwear fetish. One time, he even walked up to her dressed in women's underwear, to which she was reportedly shocked, and he seemed hurt by her inability to understand. He had hoped he found a woman who would be compliant to his will and accept his fetishes, everything, but she had disappointed him. So he returned to his secret world in his workshop. The couple said nothing more to each other about what happened, but other discoveries made her uneasy. On another occasion, she discovered a paperweight in the house shaped like a woman's breast. That really unnerved her, but Jerry Brudos had a ready explanation. Not knowing what else to do, she accepted it and forgot the incident just like she did when she caught him developing photographs of nude women. It's unlikely that Ralphine Brudos would have been able to comprehend the nature of her husband's aberrant obsession. In his book, The Serial Killer Files, Harold Schechter discusses this deviance, or paraphilia, at length. He makes mention of several horror films which depict men who dress in women's clothing as psychotic knife-wielding slashers, who hate and want to kill women. Examples of this are the movies Psycho and Dressed to Kill. However, transvestites are generally nonviolent. Schechter describes their penchant for women's clothing or undergarments, explaining that it does not turn these men into rapists or killers, but is often accompanied by feelings of shame. If they take up violence, their fetish may become part of the crimes they commit, but the desire for women's clothing is merely an expression of their particular erotic desires. He states that becoming violent is the manifestation of a different drive. Just as Jerry Brudos would go on to claim, several mass murderers and serial killers assert that as children they were forced to dress as girls, but unlike him, most did not become transvestites, while others became cross-dressers without any influence from their parents. Brudos can be identified as cross-dressing, with a female fantasy in the form of an escape mechanism, and without the desire to change gender identity. The attraction for Brudos was the desire to wear shoes and underwear, and as he grew bolder in acquiring and wearing these items, he took advantage of his ability to sneak undetected into women's bedrooms and there to overpower one sleeping woman and rape her. The victim reported it to the police, but no one traced it to Brudos. In January 1968, at the age of 28, Brudos answered the door to Linda Slauson. It was his first murder, and it was only after he described to police what he had done that day did the full extent of his sick and perverted fantasies come to light. Detectives Jim Stovall and Gene Doherty were put in charge of the investigation, and when Brudos cropped up as a potential suspect, they attempted to link the murders to him by cross-referencing his known activities against their timeline of the missing women. As described by Rule, in January 1968, Jerry Brudos had lived in the same neighborhood worked by the young encyclopedia salesgirl, the missing Linda Slauson. Brudos had indicated that he had moved to Salem in August or September 1968 and had gone to work in Lebanon, Oregon, hard by the 1-5 freeway where Jan Whitney had vanished in November. His current job was in Halsey, only 6 miles from the body sites in the Long Tom. She adds, and of course, when Karen Sprinker had disappeared from Meyer and Frank on March 27th, Brudos had lived only blocks away. During questioning, Brudos had referred vaguely to problems, without going into details, and appeared to have a lot of nylon rope in his workshop. The officers who met him later expressed to having a bad feeling about him, but that was not sufficient grounds for a warrant to search his home. It was also believed that he did not look strong enough to have carried the bodies with their respective weights, and did not drive a sports car, as described by the teenage girl who was accosted by the freckle-faced man. However, he did admit borrowing one. Most alarmingly, some rope tied into a knot in his workshop appeared to be similar to the knots used on the bodies. He allowed detectives to take a sample, but then called an attorney, Dale Drake, and asked him to find out why the police seemed so interested in him and the items in his workshop. Drake agreed to represent him should the need arise. Meanwhile, detectives secured a warrant to search Brudos' vehicle, but found that the interior had been thoroughly cleaned. Suspicious as this was, it was not damning, and Brudos once again had a ready explanation. But his aptitude for alibis run out when the adolescent girl picked him out of a photo spread as the man who recently had attempted to force her into a car. It was sufficient cause for police to arrest him, along with a weapons charge after a gun was found in his car. Investigators had hoped for a stronger case, but they had some concern that should Brudos learn the full extent of their suspicions, he might panic and flee. One day when he and Ralphine drove to Portland, the cops moved in. After his arrest that day, May 30th, 1969, he agreed to submit to an interrogation. During the routine search, he was found to be wearing women's panties. In a series of stops and false starts, and despite his attorney warning him against talking, Brudos offered a startlingly frank confession and invited detectives into his secret world. Less than a decade earlier, in 1960, Alfred Hitchcock's Psycho was released. The film was loosely based on the horrific story of Ed Gein, and showed the demented, mother-dominated nerd Norman Bates, played by Anthony Perkins, who could present a personable front as a hotel proprietor, while harboring a compulsion to fatally stab a female guest who aroused him. Gein had been told that any woman other than his mother was impure. Bates was, in effect, killing an unacceptable part of himself. When revealed that his mother had passed away, murdered by Norman himself, who dressed as her to commit murder. His condition of multiple personality disorder shocked the nation, especially with the added twist of its creepy cross-gendered manifestation. Now sitting before them, police were about to see something like the real thing, only without the excuse of mental illness. Unexpectedly, as Brudos admitted to his crimes and provided details, it became evident to detectives that he thoroughly relished describing his fetish for shoes and undergarments. As he described these things at length, he grew more excited, somehow hoping that he could convince his interrogators of the joys of indulging in such desires, but they just listened intently. It was soon evident that from January 1968 to April 1969, Brudos killed 4 women. Some newspaper reports have indicated there were 5 victims, but a 5th incident was never matched to the MO, and under questioning Brudos denied knowing the victim. He also admitted to attacking or attempting to kill several more. Most of what is known about his deadly encounters with these victims has come from his confessions, which he gave freely over a period of 3 days. Although Brudos mourned his fate and felt badly for his wife and kids, the detectives who interrogated him noted his complete absence of guilt or remorse, and noted the fact that he never lost his appetite, despite giving vivid and grotesque descriptions of his crimes. He admitted to murdering and mutilated 4 of the women, then throwing their bodies into a river after he cut parts and kept them. His first victim, Linda Slauson, was missing her left foot when her body was found. This he kept for a while after he disposed of the rest of her, using the foot to try shoes on it and taking photographs. 2 other women had their breasts removed by Brudos, for reasons he would later explain, and he also photographed them while having their lifeless bodies under his power. Most shockingly, he admitted to committing necrophilic acts by having sex with their bodies. He told how Linda Slauson, who had naively followed him to the workshop out the back of the house to pitch her encyclopedias, had been hit by him with a 2x4 hard enough to knock her out. She was then strangled, all while his wife, children and mother lived in the very same house with him. In that moment, he had a dead girl on the floor of his workshop, something he had fantasized about for a long time. He remained calm and collected, speaking with family members and urging them to go out and get some dinner at a fast food place. Unlike most serial killers, Jerry Brudos' first murder went against every instinct a killer has to get rid of the body and get as far away from the scene of the crime as humanely possible. It is only later, when they become bolder and more comfortable, that they begin to do more with corpses, if that is part of their fetish. For Jerry Brudos, that was an important part, yet with his first experience, he was more than happy with this circumstance. Straight away, with the corpse of dead girl in his workshop, he started thinking about what he could do with her, now that he had the real thing rather than just his obsessive fantasies. He had spent a considerable amount of time, years in fact, with his own private images. These had by now become clearly defined and sophisticated that when he gained the opportunity to spend actual time with a victim, he could then live out the things he had only dreamed about before. He described for the officers interrogating him how when she arrived at his home, he was in the yard. At once he began to lie to her in order to get her to come inside. Hoping to make a sale, she did so readily. Although he sent his wife and kids out to eat, a friend came over unexpectedly, and Brudos had to spend some time getting rid of him. Once alone, he quickly undressed her dead body, recalling every detail of what she was wearing, particularly her underwear, and was especially pleased that she had been wearing a pair of red panties. Getting some items from his own collection, he redressed her in them. Suddenly realizing he could not keep the body at home, he removed her foot with a hacksaw, placed it in the freezer, and then dragged the body his car and dumped it at the Willamette River. In order to make sure she would not be found, he tied the body to a car engine before throwing it over the bridge railing. Then he returned home to enjoy the part of her he had kept, which would serve as a reminder of his first kill and something he could play with. By that time he had accumulated a large collection of high-heeled shoes, and he could now try them on this severed foot and take pictures to savor the moment. He did this for as long as he could, but when the foot started to deteriorate, he tied it to a weight and threw it into the same river. He also recalled odd little details for police, such as that Slauson had a class ring on her finger. Detectives were shocked at the callous and matter-of-fact attitude Jerry Brudos expressed in recounting his first crime, along with the way he grew more arrogant as he described these gruesome details. It seemed as if he thought of these women as objects, who existed purely for his warped pleasure. He cared little for whatever lives they had lived, or would have gone on to lead had they not run into him. He only cared for his own pleasure. But that pleasure was short-lived, and before long he required a new fresh plaything in order to experience that again. When he realized that no one had stumbled upon the remains, and that police were not knocking on his door in the pursuit of Linda Slauson's killer, he went looking for another victim. With the realization that they might not find her body so long after her murder, detectives pressed for details about Jan Whitney. By that time, she had been missing for 6 months, and police theorized that her killer had come across her car while broken down. This proved correct, as Brudos described how he happened upon her, in the company of 2 men, who looked like hippies, he said. He stopped anyways, not wishing to pass up such an opportunity. Jan had given the men a ride, but when it broke down, they failed to help her fix it. And so Brudos gave them all a ride, dropping the men off, before taking Jan to his home. He went inside and told his wife he was going to go fix her car for her, telling her to wait for him, to which she complied. When he returned, he got into the car behind her, told her to close her eyes, and began playing mind games. Again, she complied, and he placed a strap over her head and around her neck to keep her from moving, then strangled her. Once dead, he had sex in the car with the body, then took her to his workshop. There he dressed her in some of his clothes and took pictures to remind him of this moment, and also sexually violated the body several more times. After that, he tied her up and raised her body into the air via a hook and pulley system he had fixed in the ceiling. Although someone could have discovered her at any moment, he left her hanging there for several days. She was only his second victim, and already he felt untouchable. It was during the several days away with family that a car crashed into the Brudos' home, leaving a gaping hole wide enough to view what was inside. But no one looked, not even police who came to investigate. That was close, Brudos told the detectives, relieved his murder spree was not brought to an abrupt end there and then. After removing the body, which by that time would have begun to decompose, he invited the officers come to inspect the accident damage. They apparently smelled nothing. However, Brudos had wrapped the corpse in a plastic sheet in another building in the yard. He described how he tried something different with this victim, taking her right breasts rather than a foot this time. I was going to make a plastic mold of it, he said in the interview, and then I could make paperweights. But he did something wrong, and so it didn't turn out the way he wanted. As with Slauson, he weighted Whitney's body down by tying it to a heavy part and threw it into the Willamette River. Oddly, he refused to give a specific location, but was telling the police so much yet holding back key details, perhaps assuming that if he kept certain things secret it would hinder their attempts at prosecuting him. They had more than enough evidence for trial, and only really prevented their ability to find the body. It was 4 months later when he went looking for his next victim. He encountered 18-year-old Karen Spangler at the department store where she'd gone to meet her mother. He had first tried for another victim and missed, so had settled on Karen, although he commented to detectives he had not liked the shoes she was wearing. Dressed in women's clothing and armed with a pistol, he forced her into his car, and they went right to his home. In his workshop he raped and forced her to pose, making her try on his collection of undergarments and pose while he took photographs. When satisfied, he killed her by hanging her by the neck from his hook. Finally, he subjected the corpse to the same indignities he'd imposed on the others, before he removed both breasts and dressed her in the long-line bra that was too large for her. He stuffed it to keep her from bleeding in his car and to make the bra look correct. He then had sex with the body again and attempted to make plastic molds using her severed breasts. As with his previous victim, he would try again and still fail. Afterwards, he employed his usual method, so the body would never be recovered, tying it to a 6-cylinder car engine with nylon cord before throwing it in the Willamette River. After the killing of Karen Spangler, Brudos made 2 attempts at ensnaring further victims, failing in his April 1969 abduction of Sharon Wood, and the following day, he was also hampered in his bid to kidnap young Gloria Jean Smith. Not wishing to lose another intended victim, Brudos used a fake police badge and the threat of arrest for shoplifting to make 22-year-old Linda Sally do what he wanted. While she remained bound in his workshop, Brudos had dinner with his family, during which she did not try to escape. But when he returned and attempted to strangle her with the strap, she fought him. He raped her as she was strangled to death, and afterwards used wires he stuck into her rib cage in an attempt to try and make her dance with an electrical current. This apparently did not work as he had planned. With these shocking confessions, it was reported in the local papers that Jerry Brudos was charged with first-degree murder on June 2, 1969, in the death of Karen Spangler. As police prepared a search warrant, Brudos was smug in the knowledge that any incriminating evidence had been removed from his workshop. He had gave his wife explicit instructions to burn his stash of female clothing. But Brudos was in for a shock, as Ralphine had not complied. A police search team then descended on the Brudos home in the 3100 block of Center Street, in an effort to locate items that might link him to one or more of the victims, as well as the intention of learning more about the man they were dealing with. They were not prepared for what they discovered. They took photographs of everything, including the hook and pulley in the ceiling used to hoist bodies into the air. They found the possible murder weapons, the nylon cord, and a leather strap that might have been used to strangle the life out of these young women. On a shelf they came across a mold made from the gruesome paperweight that Brudos had described making from a female breast. Searching further, they found his secret cache of women's shoes in various sizes and many styles of underwear, bras, girdles, panties, and slips, as well as a collection of photographs. Some featured Brudos in female underwear, but the most important ones contained horrifying images of his victims before and after death. One depicted the body of a woman suspended from the hook and pulley with a black hood over her head, while another body had been dressed in several different garments and photographed. Quite often, Brudos had cut the heads out of the pictures so he could enjoy the anonymous female form. But one photograph in particular caught their attention, and was the one that would secure the case for the prosecution against the depraved murderer. As described by Rule, it was of a girl's body, clothed in a black lace slip and panties with garters, hung suspended from the ceiling. The camera angled up to her crotch reflected in a mirror on the floor. In the lower corner of the photo, there was the frozen image of a killer, caught unawares in the mirror. It was Brudos, looking at the woman he had just murdered. Police now had solid physical evidence against their main suspect, and had also confirmed details from a survivor of a rape that Brudos had admitted to, although this woman had been unable to identify her attacker. During that incident, she had lost several pairs of shoes and some underwear. Some sources claim that neither Slosson's nor Whitney's bodies were found, while according Rule, Jan Whitney's remains were recovered in the summer of 1970. It was time for the legal process to decide Brudos' fate. Although two victims' bodies were never recovered, the district attorney had sufficient evidence in 1969 in the other cases to go forward. Prosecutors had the photographs of his depraved crimes, along with the confession, and on June 4, 1969, Jerry Brudos was arraigned. He was soon charged with additional crimes, those of the murders of Jan Whitney and Linda Sally. He was defended by Dale Drake, who was assisted by high-powered criminal lawyer George Roten. The defense and many observers expected the trial to be a fairly long and drawn-out affair, since the prosecution had an extensive witness list and an extensive collection of evidence. In response, the defense attorneys formulated a strategy based on a mental illness, since knew they could not get around Brudos' actual guilt. Brudos pleaded not guilty, and quite reluctantly, because he believed himself a genius, as not guilty by reason of insanity. This would mean that he would be processed through mental health assessments from both sides. It was during these meetings with psychiatrists that he attempted with crying and tears to convince them that he was merely the victim of an abusive mother, but most saw through this act and realized he just felt sorry for himself. He recounted an accident he suffered in 1967, when while repairing a device he had contacted a live wire, which had knocked him off his feet. Although he survived, he suffered afterward from severe headaches. It was around this time that he began knocking women down to steal their clothing, and had committed a rape in a woman's home. He said that he'd been unable to control himself. It wasn't long before he began to fantasize, as he put it, about keeping female corpses in his freezer. He wanted to be able to play with the bodies, dressing and posing them however he liked, whenever he liked. In other words, he wanted a life-sized doll. It was after his first murder that he had purchased a large freezer, and then had the means to enact his fantasy, while being prepared if such an opportunity arose again. Jerry Brudos was a man who clearly liked being in control, and he insisted that if he were treated in a hospital for his paraphilia, he would get better, and stated his determination to get out of prison and raise his own children. He was oblivious to the seriousness of the situation he now found himself in, but appeared neither confused or disoriented. Revealing no sense of remorse, he maintained an arrogant attitude towards his crimes. He would be assessed by no less than 7 psychiatrists, who indicated that while he had a personality disorder, he nevertheless was aware of what he was doing was wrong. With this professional diagnosis, Brudos would not be considered legally insane, but rather suffered from antisocial personality. This, in addition to the paraphilias of a deviant nature that he indulged with his victims. But they were in agreement, he was not psychotic. He had certainly known what he was doing to these girls, and that it was both illegal and wrong. He was undoubtedly a danger to society, and there was no question that his condition could be cured and he'd be rehabilitated. After consulting with his attorneys, who saw no way to get their client off, Brudos changed his plea to guilty in the murders of Jan Whitney, Karen Sprinker, and Linda Sally, all from Salem. For his crimes, Jerry Brudos was sentenced to 3 consecutive terms of life imprisonment with a chance for parole. During the proceedings, he also admitted to a 4th murder in Multnomah County, but the body of Linda Slauson was never found, and he was not prosecuted in the case. In a shocking twist to the case, Brudos' wife was arrested and tried as his accomplice, after a neighbor claimed to have actually seen Ralphine help Brudos with a victim, but her testimony was discredited. As reported by the Seattle Times, Jerry forbade her from visiting the garage. She had to call him on the intercom when she wanted something from the freezer. It was possible that she knew the horrible things her husband had done, or perhaps she just didn't want to know or admit that such unspeakable crimes happened in her own home. "He has to be sick," she said of her husband after his convictions. "I don't think any person in his right mind could do the things he did and not be sick. I don't have the ability to know the extent of his sickness, but I know he is ill." The 25-year-old housewife and mother had expressed amazement that people had filled the courtroom every day of her trial. Why would they sit there day after day, she wondered. I can see one day, maybe, to see what I looked like. There hadn't been any pictures of me in the newspapers before then, but I couldn't sit and watch something like that. Since there was no evidence that Ralphine knew about or participated in any of her husband's crimes, however difficult that was for many to believe, a jury acquitted Ralphine of first-degree murder charges in October 1969. In 1970, Ralphine Brudos ended her 8-year marriage to Jerry, changed her name, and moved with the children to an unknown location. As Rule puts it, she too was a victim and would most likely have wanted to put the entire experience behind her. It is possible that she would never forget. It is likely she just wanted to put the whole thing behind her, although she would probably never forget her inadvertent discoveries of his cross-dressing habit and that paperweight. By August 1970, Jerry Brudos insisted that the court should not have accepted his guilty plea to 3 first-degree murders, and thus should not have imposed consecutive life sentences. The Oregon Court of Appeals published an opinion on Brudos' petition for a rehearing, the brief having been filed by Gary Babcock. His attorney argued that once a person has received a life sentence for an offense, all consecutive life sentences must run concurrent with it. Brudos claimed Ralphine convinced me to sign the confessions to protect her and their 2 children. The response from the court explained that they could not consider the defendant's first claim of error on direct appeal, and the defendant instead had to present his grounds for setting aside his pleas of guilty within the appropriate legislative framework. In a nutshell, his appeal was denied, as were any and all subsequent appeals, including the one in which he claimed he'd suffered from hypoglycemia when offering his guilty plea. Having been in prison longer than any other inmate in Oregon, Brudos periodically comes up for parole, something that results in a flurry of protesting letters from Oregon residents to the parole board to prevent him from gaining his freedom. Brudos makes his plea, insisting that he's no longer a threat to society, and even goes so far as to claim he did not commit the murders. In his many appeals to the board, he tried to mitigate his crimes by blaming his mother's abuse and neglect, and mentioned having blackouts during his crime spree, indicating that at the time the world had seemed increasingly less real to him. In 1995, the parole board voted to keep him in prison for life. However, Brudos still came up for it every 2 years, in a misguided view that one day he will be free. Yet he has shown no remorse. As reported in an Associated Press article, Brudos still refused Thursday to say why he'd killed, contending that he would be in danger if he did. He told board members that he was ready to join society, that in more than 30 years at Oregon State Penitentiary, he had availed himself of every possible rehabilitation program for sex-offending murderers. Brudos was then quoted as saying, "I think I've got a whole new personality." A reporter for the Oregonian said that Brudos is certain he won't kill again, but he won't say why. The article went on to recount an encounter with Brudos by a young woman on a tour of the prison. When he took her hand, she felt that something wasn't right in the way he looked at her and jerked it away. The encounter chilled her. "Humans have an instinct," says the reporter, "and it is important to heed it. Lives depend on it." But Brudos himself indicated that his own life depended on divulging nothing in the presence of reporters who attended the parole hearings. "These people here will get me killed," he was quoted in the Corvallis Gazette-Times. He firmly believed that any publicity of the crimes he committed more than 30 years ago might inspire violence against him within the prison. In August 2003, Jerry Brudos once again sought his freedom, and as they have done in the past, the parole board members once again denied his request. This time they made their decision after only a half-hour interview with the convicted killer, explaining that they did not need a full hearing. This decision was applauded by the Gazette-Times, who stated that a man who could mutilate and murder 5 sick, young women, they decided, was not a likely candidate for responsible citizenship, especially since he did it all without ever alerting his wife to the devious acts he performed inside his home-based workshop. Within prison, Brudos was considered a model patient who consistently denies his crimes and is allowed to walk around the prison unsupervised. Adept at computers, Brudos was allowed by the prison to sell leather key fobs with his name engraved on them through their prison store. Rule wrote in a 1988 update of her book that Sharon would purchase one, a reminder of her ordeal and a symbol for assisting with her work in empowering women to defend themselves against physical attack. Brudos was once again up for parole in August 2005, the year that Rule predicted he was actually eligible for release, based on serving the minimum time for his 3 consecutive sentences. The result was the same as before, and he was denied. Under the dated Oregon system, he will come up for a hearing every 2 years until he dies or gains his freedom. Although he adjusted to prison life, Brudos invested much of his time in working on ways of getting out. On March 28, 2006, it was reported in Salem, Oregon Statesman Journal, the 67-year-old Jerry Brudos had passed away from natural causes. By serving almost 37 years, he was the longest incarcerated inmate at Oregon State Penitentiary. At the time of Brudos' mid-1969 guilty plea to the strangulation murders of 3 young women, for which he was convicted and imprisoned, and Rule predicted that he would be in prison for about 36 years. It is understood that his time in prison was uneventful, with Brudos apparently a model prisoner. Brudos, who was noted as a computer expert in prison, always held out hope for release, and went before the parole board at regular intervals and insisted he was no longer a danger to society. His release was always denied, however, because he never expressed remorse for his crimes, blaming his lethal act on his mother's abuse. At times, he even recanted his confessions and said he was not guilty, but also admitted that killing had relieved stress. Despite always being denied parole, over the years he received privileges in the prison, including unsupervised mobility. Some reports indicate that he had been treated for colon cancer, and during the week before his death was admitted to the prison infirmary. Guards found him dead in his bed around 5:10 a.m. on that March morning. Case 6. The grisly realness of street violence is one of the defining features John Singleton's classic film Boys in the Hood. It is a coming-of-age story depicting black youths trying to navigate life in inner-city gangland. It is one of the defining films which captures gang life in 90s Los Angeles. Even today, the film serves as a harrowing reminder of how gang criminality and violence can suddenly and cruelly sweep up even the most promising youth and destroy lives. Yet even after viewing the film, few could imagine how closely life would imitate art for 2 young men, the Avery brothers Ch and Lloyd II, both of who worked on the film. The eldest of the 2 Avery brothers was Ch Avery. His early life would draw eerie parallels to the protagonist of Boys in the Hood, Trey Styles. Similar to the film's depiction of Trey Styles, Ch Avery was a model student with a bright future and seemingly limitless potential. Yet despite his family's best efforts to protect him from street life, Ch would willingly take a dark turn towards gang affiliation. He eventually found himself trapped in the world of gangland crime and mayhem. Ch's embrace of the gangster lifestyle was brought on, in large part, by the company he surrounded himself with and the choices he willingly made. Born on October 7, 1971, in Los Angeles, California, Ch Avery was raised by loving parents Lloyd Sr. and Linda Avery. Ch was the middle child of 5 siblings. His parents had struggled greatly to work themselves out of near poverty in their early lives. Ch's father Lloyd Sr. had built himself his own repair business, and his mother Linda fought her way through discriminatory hiring practices to become a senior accounting clerk at their local bank. The Averys' focus was to have their children succeed and to provide better opportunities than they had growing up on the streets, free from the ballasts of street and gang influences. In this effort, the Averys spent a lot of time with all their children and stressed Christian values and good behavior. They demanded academic excellence from each of their children. Wholesome outlets, such as family outings to go fishing or hunting, served as a brief escape from inner-city life. During the week, the Avery children were given extracurricular lessons in swimming, gymnastics, and Little League baseball. The Averys even had a pool installed outside their home, all in an effort to keep their children off the streets. As an adult Cha would recall, we were silver spoon kids. We never needed for nothing. Cha's upbringing would seem to provide the environment and tools needed to succeed. Yet he would become one of the incredibly unique individuals to turn their back on privileged family life in favor of hardcore gang involvement and crime. Cha had a seemingly ideal childhood in the Los Angeles suburb of Windsor Hills. With its palm tree-lined streets and bungalow houses, Windsor Hills was a firmly middle-class neighborhood. Yet a sinister shadow was just around the corner. As with many inner-city neighborhoods, Windsor Hills bordered the gang-infested divisions of Inglewood and South LA. This proximity to gang life would prove to be Cha and Lloyd Avery II's undoing. Cha would later say, as a defendant in court, the family love was always there. I just felt some kind of attraction to the streets. Cha's downward spiral began at the age of 17 from a seemingly sensible act of parenting. His parents would enroll Cha in a busing program, which prevented him from attending Crenshaw High, where he would have been mixed in with the locals of ganglands from Inglewood and South LA. Instead, Cha's parents enrolled him at Beverly Hills High School, a predominantly white school that catered to the more affluent suburbs of Los Angeles. Yet Cha would still have to take the public bus from his house through some of the worst ghettos of LA to reach Beverly Hills High. Rap and its pop status had exploded by the time Cha Avery was 17, and like many youths in inner-city LA, he had developed a taste for wearing black Raider hats, baggy sweatshirts, and khakis. This style of dress was meant to imitate the rap artists he enjoyed listening to, but was also the perennial uniform of LA gang culture. Cha's parents would normally disapprove of the attire and its connotations, but as Lloyd Sr. said, a friend of mine made his son look, dress, non-gang, and somebody stabbed him on the bus. Somebody sharpened up a screwdriver, put a point on it, and stabbed him, paralyzed him a little while. That taught me something. I told Cha whatever he needed to do to get from point A to point B, you do that. Cha's dress sense made him a standout figure at Beverly Hills High, an honor student with a 3.6 grade point average, but his outward appearances made him look gang-affiliated. Cha would eventually remember, all these little Caucasian kids thought I was the stereotypical gang-banger they've seen on TV. They just idolized it. As Cha began to play up the role, his reputation grew not only at school, but out on the streets as well. Cha began to hang out and party more and more with cliques from his neighboring Inglewood and South LA, many of which had gang affiliations. Despite this, Cha excelled in his studies to such an extent that come graduation time, he was accepted to the prestigious universities of UCLA and UC Berkeley. But Cha began to be intimidated by the idea of attending university and his ability to win a much-needed scholarship and financial backing. As a fallback, Cha instead decided to defer his acceptance to university, to stay close to home, and attend a trade school like his father. It was this decision to stay in his familiar surroundings which would exacerbate Cha Avery's imitation of gang life into the real world. I was living a kind of double life. At home, I was an ideal son. I looked up to my dad. Then, as soon as my father turned his back, I'd be out doing things he couldn't have imagined. Cha's popularity on the street would grow from his willingness to commit random acts of violence and petty crime. His carefully crafted gangster charisma and ability to bring in girls from Beverly Hills to inner-city parties would open further doors to street life. In order to solidify his image, Cha would eventually form his own clique, which he named the DGF, Don't Give a Fuck Crew. As Cha himself explained, even this clique would not be involved in regular gang activities, of actual gang involvement. We don't sell the dope, don't sling the guns in the way a gang does, might steal a few things, might have a few guns, but they mostly have parties, chase girls. But Cha was consciously building his reputation-hardened street thug. A schoolmate, Doran Reed, would recall about Cha during this time. Cha once came to a party with Lloyd II and I. This whole other gang is there. All of a sudden, Cha starts throwing rocks at them. The other gang was like, what the fuck is going on? One of them recognizes Cha and was like, Cha? Oh, let it go. That whole gang was there, and they didn't fuck with Cha. That's a little insight into how crazy Cha was. Cha's street credit only continued to rise. His success in the creation of DGF would only make the lure of gang life even more appealing for Che. With the same drive he pursued academic excellence, Che deliberately set his sights on membership and status within elite gang circles. This decision led him to his local chapter of the Rollin 60s Crips, a subdivision of the West Side Crips criminal network, one of the most violent gangs in the United States at the time. Che was seduced by the Rollin 60 status, reputation, and the ultra street credit that came with Crips affiliation. The atmosphere, putting yourself in danger, the illegal activities. "I can't explain it," he said. "I just wanted to fit in with them. I wanted to be part of the best." In 1990, Che made inroads with the Rollin 60s, and his sustained involvement put him on a path to full initiation. If you wanted to establish yourself as someone in your hood to be reckoned with, if you wanted to earn your stripes, or even give your neighborhood a name, if you're from a neighborhood and you already have a reputation of being troublemakers or being the toughest, then you have to not only defend your neighborhood, but let's go over here to such and such's neighborhood and put in work without saying too much. Put in work, terrorize them, whatever comes with that. To this day, Che never speaks of his crimes as a prospect for Rollin 60s. Little is known about the specifics of the work Che put in for the Crips gang during this time, but his efforts resulted in his full initiation into his local Rollin 60s chapter, and he earned the name Blood Killer, or BK for short. Che was welcomed into the gang, but the celebration was short-lived as he quickly realized the true danger of outlaw life. Weeks after initiation into the Rollin 60s, one of his local clique's youngest members was horrifically gunned down in broad daylight. Jason Jones, a child of only 14 years of age, was waiting for his friends by a gas station. Even deep Rollin 60s turf was no protection from drive-by shootings. A rival gang from neighboring Compton would roll up on Jones, shooting him over 72 times with semi-automatic weapons. The July 1990 slaying of Jones enraged Avery, and on a deeper level the systemic failure of local authorities to manage any leads in the case, which was soon consigned to the pile of unsolved murder cases. This would be the first in a myriad of gangland killings that Che would find himself mired in. Later that year, Che's best friend and Rollin 60's associate Terrence Ferris was killed by gunfire while in his parked car. Che was once again beset by anger and a sense of injustice that nothing was done by law enforcement to bring Ferris's killers to justice. These emotions were temporarily offset by the unexpected opportunity to work on the film Boys in the Hood, which both Che and his younger brother Lloyd Avery too would contribute. Che's dress sense and knowledge of street culture earned him a place as an unofficial film consultant. This temporary respite from the violent unpredictability of gang life was short-lived. Only a few months after shooting on the film ended, Che's friend and mentor Earl Little Looney Williams was gunned down by a rival clique of Rollin 60s. Intergang rivalries often occur in expansive criminal networks, and the Rollin 60s Crips were no exception to this. According to Che, Williams was challenged to a fist fight by a neighboring Rollin 60s clique as punishment for not putting in work for the gang. Yet when Williams showed up for the fight, he was met with a hail of bullets. The murder of yet another friend pulled Che even deeper into his downward spiral of criminality and rage. Che began carrying a .22 caliber revolver at all times. Driving in his car while drunk, Che would find opportunistic crimes to commit with his sidearm. This would soon lead to a full-on crime spree of stick-up robberies mainly targeting jewelry and jackets. Che would later claim he did these crimes out of a sense of rage and indignity to the system, which allowed public murders of his good friends go unsolved. Che would give away most of his robbery hauls, yet continued his terrorizing string of armed robberies. The money, the material things, didn't give me as much satisfaction as seeing people scared, Che would claim in court. I wanted to see somebody else feel the same pain and frustration that I was feeling. The life of crime would finally catch up with Che in 1991, after a failed robbery led to Avery's arrest. He was quickly identified and linked to 2 earlier criminal incidents. He spent 7 months in jail before pleading guilty on all 9 felony charges of armed robbery. During his sentencing, Court Judge Charles E. Horan struggled to understand how gang life could exert such influence over a teen of such intelligence and promise. Judge Horan would ask how a kid who is not in any real way disadvantaged, a kid who has not been abused, beaten, molested, a kid who has been taken to school by his parents, who's been clothed, fed and loved and taken to church, all of a sudden, at age 19 or 20, decides that the family values or law is of less importance to him than gang values. Avery could offer no explanation except the attraction of street life. His time in holding before the trial, Avery had plenty to consider. How had a young life of such promise and ambition lead here? Despite his decision to pursue a life of gang involvement and crime, still respected his parents most, especially his father. The guilt and remorse he felt was overwhelming. An adult would later explain, all of the stupid nights just doing stupid shit, every fucking night, just senseless, brother. From his time in holding waiting trial, Chu would assess the path that landed him in jail. Frequent visits from his parents helped Chu realize the emptiness of gang life, a path which only lead two ways, prison or death. As quickly as Chu adopted the ways of street life and criminality, he again swore off them all. Avery would make an on-the-record denouncement of his own gang culture and asked forgiveness from his parents, who even now supported him in this most difficult moment in his life. Such was the conviction of Chu's renouncement of gangs and crime. He fully acknowledged culpability in it all. Chu would astonish both judge and jury during a sentencing hearing on June 2nd by interrupting the prosecutor during a cross-examination. "I know I was wrong," he shouted tearfully. "I know I have to do time, without a doubt. There's a lot of temptation on the streets. The attraction to the lifestyle is so strong. The peer pressure is so strong. Kids feel like they have something to prove to everyone except the right people." Over the next several years, Chu would be transported to several different prisons within the Californian state penal system. He eventually became a resident in the notorious Chino Prison, California Institution for Men, and was drafted into mandatory prison labor as a forest firefighter, during which he fought wildfires with other Chino inmates. Chu's time in Chino was not an easy one. Violence and gang retribution were a constant threat. Being unaffiliated with a gang while incarcerated was a prospective invitation for robbery, beatings and rape at the hands of his fellow inmates. It was Chu's savvy street smarts and intelligence that kept his head above water. A Mexican gang robbed him at knife point, and when a cellmate ratted him out for sharpening shanks, Chu even spent time in the infamous Chino hole. But despite the hardships of incarceration, Chu would come to fully change his mindset and his ways. He befriended former members of rival street gangs and would take up the trade of carpentry and cabinet making. Chu fully expected to come back to a straight life and back to his family values once related. One thing he had not counted on was his younger brother Lloyd Avery, too, following him into the downward spiral of gang life, crime and murder. As Chu put it, "When I went to jail, Lloyd was a goody two-shoes. By the time I got out, he already had a case." Only there would be no redemption for his younger brother Lloyd. Lloyd Avery, too, would eventually have multiple cases against him by the time his brother was released from prison. Even afterwards, further charges would include burglary, weapons possession, and battery. Lloyd Avery, too,'s path towards gang life would be even faster and more nefarious than his brother's. After making a cameo role in Boys in the Hood, as the gunman who kills the character Ricky Baker, he would rise to prominence within the LA ganglands. Lloyd was bestowed an unearned street credit of sorts due to his role as a shotgun wheedling blood. Lloyd made appearances in several other films which only entrenched his reputation as a gangbanger and bizarrely his standing in actual gang circles. "No one could put their finger on it," says Doran Reed, the brother of Lloyd's close friend. "People that knew Lloyd were like, what the fuck? How did Lloyd turn into a gangster?" Lloyd Avery, too,'s career in Hollywood's film industry would be in tandem with his involvement in robbery, drug dealing, and actual gang involvement. Lloyd's descent into the darkest reaches of life on the streets hit rock bottom in 1999 when he went on to commit a double homicide over a drug debt dispute. Even while on the run from law enforcement, Lloyd would pursue his film career, attending casting calls and script readings. However, law enforcement would eventually catch up with him. In 2001, Lloyd Avery, too, was sentenced to life in prison on 2 counts of first-degree murder, which landed him in the notorious maximum security prison, Pelican Bay, that same year. "When I think back on Lloyd, I think it's one of the greatest missed opportunities," Roth says. "Had he been able to control himself and not commit a double murder, there is no doubt he would have been a big success." Much like his brother Chu, Lloyd, too, would go on to try and turn his life around while incarcerated. He, too, renounced gang life and instead took up the Bible. Lloyd, too, would become a born-again Christian in prison, and go even further by preaching the Bible's teachings to other prison inmates. Lloyd, too,'s devoutness earned him the nickname Baby Jesus in Pelican Bay. In a cruel twist of irony, Lloyd's bid at redemption through Christ would be the reason for his gruesome satanic death. As Lloyd Avery, too, had made a name for himself in Pelican Bay Penitentiary as a man of Christ, His new cellmate Kevin Roby had too earned a reputation, becoming infamous for his belief in Satan. Kevin Roby's story, which led to his own incarceration, was of a much more sinister nature than Lloyd too. The gruesome rape and murder of his own sister earned Kevin Roby a life sentence at Pelican Bay, without the possibility of parole. During his time in Pelican Bay, Roby's penchant for performing satanic rituals in his cell earned the nickname Satanic Christ. In 2005, Kevin Roby was transferred to be cell mates with Lloyd II Avery. Lloyd II would begin in earnest to spread his evangelical teachings to his new cellmate. Lloyd even wrote in a letter to the prison chaplain, "I know God has him around me for a reason. He, Roby, knows very well that I am a devout Christian, and I pray for him to the Lord every day that he gives his life to God." But it would be Lloyd who would give up his life for God in the end. Avery's attempts at winning theological arguments with Roby would build in heated animosity in their cell. Roby would later say in a deposition statement, "He was pushing his agenda to convert me to Christianity, which led to us fighting." One particular fight would end, according to court records, with Roby choking Avery so violently that Avery's lungs began to internally bleed, even as he lay unconscious on his cell room floor. The autopsy report would suggest that Roby would continue beating Avery's unconscious body, causing blunt force trauma to his head. For the next 36 hours, Roby would successfully cover up his cellmate's murder, placing Avery's dead body under bedsheets, even using string to mimic arm movement, which fooled prison guards during morning and evening roll call. The following day, the guards who discovered Avery's body were met with a horrifying scene. Roby, using Avery's own blood, had drawn a giant pentagram on the cell floor and dragged Avery's corpse onto the center, spreading out the arms and legs to align with the pentagram. This satanic ritual, Roby would say in a deposition hearing, was intended as a warning. "He is next on the agenda once I accomplish what I want to accomplish in this realm." Roby would go to trial for the satanic murder of Lloyd II, but as he was already sentenced for homicide and was not eligible for the death penalty. From a promising family of 5, it was II Avery brother who chose a path of gang affiliation and crime. But only one of these brothers would be able to escape a violent death. After the murder of his brother Avery would move to Augusta with his own family to once again turn a new page in his life. Even here the shadow of gang life followed him. "There are Crips and Bloods out here," he said, "and they seriously think they're Crips and Bloods and claim streets from LA. There are guys out here from Hoover Crips. There are guys out here from Rollin' 60s, so they say." Despite this, Ch kept his vow to renounce gang life. He has a successful business, while making sure his son, who he named Lloyd after his deceased brother, chooses the right path. Though Ch's life now follows the straight and narrow, he still keeps some mementos from his brother. The Bible Lloyd II used while in Pelican Bay still has his handwriting in the margins of almost each page. Today, Ch chooses to focus on the silver lining of his brother's life and death. He died in God's favor. That's what this story is about.